Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time zone you're in. Namaste. My name is Manjari Patwardhan. Welcome to this orientation for college-bound students and their parents that is organized by Indian Americans of Irvine and Orange County. Today on the program, we have two student leaders who are currently attending college. We have Rashmi Samant at Oxford University and Arnav Kejriwal at Rutgers University. A little bit about the speakers. Rashmi obtained her undergraduate education in India and joined Oxford University as a graduate student. She was the first Indian student to be elected as president of the prestigious office of the Oxford University Students' Union. She's an active advocate of climate justice. Welcome today, Rashmi. Arnav currently serves as National President of Hindu Students' Council, the oldest and largest organization for Hindu youth across North America. One of the HSC's pillars is advocacy, at standing up for the Hindu community in areas such as Hindu phobia, Hindu rights, and more. In recent years, HSC has helped draw awareness towards Hindu phobia on college campuses globally at institutions that include Rutgers, Harvard, Oxford, and beyond. Welcome today, Arnav. We also have two social activists with us today, Raj Rao and Surya Kanegaukar. Raj is an active member of the community interested in ensuring that Hindu Americans can freely practice their diverse traditions in a pluralistic American society. He obtained his BA at USC and his MA and MBA at the Middlebury Institute in Monterey. Currently, Raj works as program manager in the consumer electronics manufacturing segment. Raj has lived and worked in China and is totally fluent in Mandarin. So welcome, Raj. Surya Kanegaukar is a commodities trader based in Switzerland. He has published over 40 articles for media platforms, including The Hindu and India Global Business. These include themes ranging from Indic culture to economic development. Born in Norway, raised in Europe and South Korea, he studied in international schools before heading to England for university. He completed his undergraduate degree in economics from the University of Warwick and a master's in metal and energy finance from Imperial College London. Welcome today, Surya. We also have Suhag Shukla, an attorney who is the co-founder of Hindu American Foundation, HAF in short. She will provide us updates on the status of caste-based discrimination cases that are pending in California courts, and also some clarity on what constitutes legal discrimination. Last but not the least, we have Pandit Satish Sharma from the UK, a TEDx speaker and a frequent guest on programs on dharmic issues. He's an author of the book Caste Conversion, A Colonial Conspiracy, What Every Hindu and Christian Must Know About Caste. He will provide us with the history and the origins of the caste debate and how that issue was solved in the UK. Today's session will be moderated by Dr. Praveen Sinha, who's a professor of accountancy with over 25 years of experience. He earned his PhD from Carnegie Mellon University and has taught at prestigious institutions like Cornell prior to settling in California. He's the founder of the group Indian Americans of Irvine and Orange County, a group that is less than 1 year old and that is hosting this event today. All yours, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you, Manjari, very much. Welcome, everyone. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to come in here and attend this session. We have carefully put together content that will be helpful to you, whether you are a child or a student going to college, or if you're a parent of the child who's going to a college. And even if you have children who have graduated from college, you may find this content very helpful. I think it's important. The reason we put together this event is because the majority of the parents of first generation Americans never had attended US college, especially at the undergraduate level. And for that reason, they do not have a much sense of how to understand the forces that will be influencing the children once they are in college and not at home, where they have been closely monitoring them for quite some time. So we will help them prepare the child and themselves in terms of dealing with those challenges. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background. I think some or most of you who are aware may have seen increasingly negative articles on the, let me quickly get this part here. Okay. Negative articles on India, whether that be CAA or a Kashmir issue, or the farmers' protests, or the coverage of COVID surge, in which we were shown large numbers of burning pyres, something that responsible journalists will never do. The narrative over the past 5 to 10 years has been that there is a rise of Hindutva, an increase in religious intolerance in India, it has been hard to get any good news about India in the mainstream media, which is part of this narrative building machinery. Though the latest Pew survey has totally debunked this narrative, it has not been easy for our community to digest this daily dosage of lies, distortions, and exaggerations. Um, our children who primarily live in the social media get a very biased view of India just because of these news narratives that have been floating around. The same holds for the coverage of Indian American diaspora in the US. Though it is impossible to present them in anything but positive light given our enormous success, repeated attempts are made to exploit the fault lines in the Indian community, just to create a divide, whether that be on a Hindu Sikh issue or the one that got most extensive attention lately is the caste discrimination among the Indian Americans. Again, a blatant lie based on a Equity Labs fake survey that mainstream media had no problem propagating. Thankfully, a recent Carnegie Endowment survey has proved that this narrative to be nothing but a big fat lie. Not surprisingly, the survey is nowhere in the news when we need to be talking about it. However, this combined narrative of rising Hindutva and caste based discrimination, which is often referred as Dalit oppression, is not going away. The forces behind this fake narrative are very strong and very well organized and have the potential to do a considerable harm, especially to our young children and those entering the college. As you learned more from other speakers, several UC campuses and the entire CSE student union, without any evidence, passed a resolution demanding Dalits be considered a protected class. Similar resolutions are considered in Santa Clarita County, and it has become an issue within Cisco systems as well. Suhagji will provide an update on this later on the legal developments in this area. So without much delay, let's get started with the program. We'll first have Rashmi and Arnab talk about Hindu phobia on their college campus. So Rashmi, it's all yours. So please go ahead. The stage is yours.
Hi, hello. Thank you, Praveenji, for inviting me to this event. And I think it's wonderful to share platform with so many amazing people who have done so much to lobby for Hindu rights and to, to repeatedly stand up every time there have been instances of discrimination against Hindus. I think a lot of what I'm going to speak is going to be my story, and it is a very personal, it's something that I went through, and it's a personal story, and I think I'm going to go through that and then maybe underline some of the conclusions that I draw from this. And I'm not saying that it's something everybody will face. I hope they don't. And I think raising awareness is key to make it, to ensuring that we don't face such things and we're not taken by surprise when these things happen. A major part, is basically where I come from. I was born and raised in Udupi. It's a temple town on the southwestern coast of India in the state of Karnataka. I moved to the UK around 8 months ago to start my master's at the University of Oxford. I live in a pretty international household, and we have people from every country that you can possibly imagine. It's quite a beautiful community. In February this year, almost 3 to 4 months after coming to Oxford, I ran for president. It was quite, I think, quite a confident move on my part, I must say, to run for president just months after getting here. But then I did run for president, and in a historic election, in one of the highest voter turnouts and margins, I went on to become the first Indian woman to take office. I know it kind of pretty, I know it sounds pretty silly. Who cares about student unions? But Oxford presidents do go on to become prime ministers and presidents of countries, which makes it all the more special. So, no sooner than the results were announced, a niche group started attacking me by twisting my old captions and painting a very demonic image of me. They brought my faith into question. My parents were paraded as fascists. There have been, my opinion is that there have been so many stereotypes reinforced in the Western academia over time that it's very easy for people to believe a terrifying image of a Hindu. After all, the first attack on Jews was through spreading anti Semitic rhetorics and demonizing them. And hence, when they were brutally and even so ethnically cleansed, people turned a blind eye because the setting was already done. the society already sort of was pushed to believe that, that they were bad people. I think there is implicit Hinduphobic sentiments. It is becoming more and more apparent with the incidents that are coming out, and these are being weaponized by niche elements from time to time to conveniently eliminate Hindus who are doing well in the Western academia or the setting. And academia is mostly a festering spot for these sentiments. I myself had to fight back from oblivion and build back step by step. It was very difficult, but it happened. And as of yesterday, the university finally upheld my stance in this. So I think there are a few things here. One thing is that we need to recognize that there is institutional Hinduphobia. We as Hindus, I think it is hard because I myself as a Hindu, I had hard time grasping my head around it unless and until it happened to me. But had I known about it, I think I would have been better equipped to handle this kind of a rhetoric and war of narratives, which it has, sort of devolved into. And part of it comes from the fact that we are extremely prosperous, hardworking, and we don't ask for freebies. So we are extremely hardworking and prosperous, and that is something that is not, it's not accepted by part of the community. And then there are all of these rhetorics that come into play to sort of downplay our achievements and what we've achieved so far. With that, I'd like to just conclude that as a community, I think we have to come together. If not anything, the conclusion that we got yesterday from the University of Oxford, which is so deep state that it's, I think it's a task in itself to get anything out of them, and for them to acknowledge that there has been harassment and bullying is itself huge. And it's testament to the fact that we Hindus as a community can achieve a lot, and that we do have it in us, and it happens to people, and it happened to me, it can happen to anyone. And there is no behavior that is necessary for you to stop from being attacked or from being marked. They will do it irrespective if they see that you're being prosperous and you're proud of your identity. But I think partly we can fight this by coming together, by forming support systems, and by being increasingly aware that this is very much a possibility. So with that, I think I'd like to wrap up my tiny little monologue. Thank you again, Praveenji, for organizing this. I think this is very important, and all the work you do is definitely very important for our community and for our young students.
Thank you, Rashmi. I'm sure our audiences have a lot of questions for you. Please keep sending them on the chat and we'll compile them. I'm just going to give you a small anecdote in this regard. When I was preparing for this program, or when the thought was coming to my mind that I should do something like this, because I was fully aware of your story. So I started asking my friends that, do you know who is Rashmi Samant? Invariably, the answer was no. Who is she? And that was really mind-boggling to me, that such a huge injustice was being done to one of our youngsters, aspiring young woman who is going to be a future leader, which I'm 100% sure you will be. And nobody even knew what happened to her and how much of an injustice was done. So that certainly raised my antenna, and I really thought it is important that our community should wake up, because it's not in my backyard. It will happen in your backyard. It's only a matter of time. So I'm glad you came, excuse me, and shared your story. I will have more questions come in when we are done. So I just want you to all who are here, think carefully how you were like when you entered this land. I think it happened to Rashmi in a matter of 3 to 6 months. Huge accomplishment and a huge amount of stress. So I think whatever you have achieved, Rashmi, is very, very creditable and very honorable of you to behave the way you did and the way you've handled it. I'm sure the justice will be served and you will get what you truly deserve. Presidency of Oxford Union is a huge thing. It's not a small thing. You put it lightly, but it's a huge thing. And Benazir Bhutto was a president of Oxford Union, if you want to put it under perspective. So what they did was they basically tried to stop a rising young star, and that is part of the Hinduphobia. So I'll stop at this, and I'm sure a lot of you have more questions. Please keep sending them on the chat so that we can bring it up when the session comes to an end. So I'm going to bring the conversation to now Arnav, who is on other side of the Atlantic, but went through similar experiences, but more at a group level. So Arnav, the stage is all yours. Please go ahead.
Namaste, Praveenji. Thank you for having me. And sorry to everyone, I'm a little under the weather, so I'm sorry if I cough or hopefully I'm audible. But so the first thing I'll say is just a quick clarification. I'm the national president for Hindu Students Council. So I'm no longer a student. I was born and brought up in the US. I live in Dallas, Texas. And the way Hindu Students Council works is we are probably the only organization in the US that is for Hindu youth by Hindu youth. So what I mean by that is all of us in our national leadership are in our late 20s, maybe early 30s. All of us were born and brought up, whether it's in the US or Canada. And we saw the challenges that we faced in high school and colleges growing up here. And so we're all very aware of what children, in college are going through today. And we try to be a group that can connect with those students from the same perspective that they come from, right? So from that American or Canadian background. So Hindu Students Council, as was graciously brought up at the beginning, is one of the largest and oldest organizations for youth of Hindu origin in the US and Canada. We were started in 1990, and we have over 50 active chapters across the US. And we have a threefold mission: advocacy, empowerment, and seva. So obviously the conversation of Hindu phobia focuses on the first two, but for a long time, we've tried to get students to look beyond just practicing their Hindu identity in mandirs and temple, in puja, etc. And part of that is understanding that you as a student in a country that values free speech, you have the right to assert your identity, to be proud of who you are, what your identity represents, and be able to stand up for issues that affect your community. So with that, it's just a little bit of background on what HSE does, but obviously Rashmi just spoke, and Rashmi, huge congratulations. I know yesterday's announcement is a massive step globally. You've been a beacon for Hindu phobia, the fight against Hindu phobia across the world. So if Oxford is kind of number one on the hit list for Hindu phobia, number two is probably most certainly Rutgers, right? So Hindu Students Council, one of our largest chapters, is at Rutgers University. Praveenji, should I be sharing the PowerPoint from my screen or Neeraj? Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
wonderful. Thank you, Neeraj. If we can go to the first slide. So I'm sure most of you have probably seen some of the negativity around Rutgers. I'll still give a little bit of a recap, but Rutgers Hindu Students Council is one of our oldest and largest chapters. Of course, New Jersey is a hotspot for the Hindu community in general, so Rutgers is one of our anchor chapters. They're also one of our most advocacy-centered chapters in the sense that they've got to deal with Professor Audrey Treshke, right? So this is just one example of the Hindu phobia that students deal with, and in 10 minutes I can't cover more than one, but who is Audrey Treshke? She's a professor of South Asian and Asian studies at Rutgers. I think I lost the slide. Neeraj, does the slide show up or?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So let's go to the next slide, please. So there's a very long report, and I'll share a link for anyone that's interested or hasn't seen all of it about Audrey Treshke, right? But she's a very active Twitter fanatic, and she's also a writer and all of these things. But here's a couple of snapshots of some of the things she says that are highly concerning to Hindu students in the broader Hindu community, right? So her most famous tweet she posted a couple years ago. For anyone unfamiliar with these episodes, in Valmiki's telling, I'm loosely translating, Sita basically tells Rama he's a misogynist pig, right? So what kind of professor speaks like this? I don't know. The person she was citing has said that the citation is out of context and they're surprised she was able to get away with it, or that she even tried putting it on Twitter. Right below that, this happened in December this past year. She wrote that the Bhagavad Gita is simply a rationale for mass slaughter. And then on the right, and this is kind of where a lot of the recent momentum at Rutgers starts in terms of the students' protests. Treshke started taking some of the Capitol riots that occurred, and there was signs of like an Indian flag, which I'm sure most of you know was not even a BJP or Hindu for that matter. It was, a Christian from South India, and she took that to say, okay, these are the BJP right-wingers, right-wing IT cell, et cetera, et cetera. This is signs that there's, linkages between the right wing in the US and the right wing in India. But she kept taking it further. And she would even say that students are part of this BJP IT cell. And this is where it started getting very dicey for students, that you are personally attacking us or making us question you're making us answer if we are affiliated with overseas political parties, even though we were born in the US, we're Hindu, we have nothing to do with what you're talking about, right? So next slide, please. So these are just a couple examples, but students at Rutgers, especially in Rutgers HSE, have been highly overwhelmed given just her very brazen attitude in terms of being able to say whatever she wants with very little evidence. And a lot of times students get harassed for it. So a couple of HSC students actually went on a podcast a couple of months ago to talk about Hinduphobia at Rutgers, right? Very professionally done. They spoke very nicely. And one of the questions the students were asked was, what do you wish you could do better on campus or as a Hindu, right? And their answer was, well, we wish we had more ability to be able to authentically read Hindu texts. And the next day, Audrey Trushke tweets, "It has come to my attention, some students at Rutgers wish they had read more Hindu texts. We're doing this work, join us." So imagine that you're a student at a university trying to take a stand against a professor who's saying these things about your tradition, and then you go on a podcast saying you want to learn more authentically about your tradition, and the very next day that professor has a tweet in response to you, right? It's highly concerning. So our students have been agitated all year. They've not been comfortable with Trushke, and they've done a great job trying to fight kind of her rhetoric, but this is kind of a sign of the level of extent that professors are trying to encode Hinduphobia in anything they do. So next slide, please. Those same students, they themselves leaked this. So I'm not sharing this conversation internally, but they leaked this on an anonymous handle called Hindu on Campus, where they found that Trushke, after that same event, had gone to their parents' Twitter profiles their LinkedIn profiles. And this was exactly what I'm sure Suhagji will mention it later. This is similar to what Trushke did with some HAF members and trying to link them to groups like the BJP or RSS, right? So these students started freaking out. Okay, if my parents even are at one event where someone might be wearing a shirt that says BJP or Modi or something, she's suddenly gonna defame me or try to make me look like a lunatic, right? So this is highly unprofessional, and Rutgers actually did not take any action against this particular incident either. Next slide. So Trushke is, again, just one example, but she's a big nexus in the entire equation because a lot of professors around the country band together with her. So at Indiana University, there was a freshman, Rama Sardar, whose case is not as well known as Rashmi's or some of the Rutgers students, but Rama is quickly becoming another beacon of the fight against Hinduphobia in the US because she posted an article talking about Trushke's Hinduphobia and how it reverberates across college campuses. And after a month, the Indiana University editorial took it down in disagreement. And obviously there's some free speech concerns there, but Trushke tweeted out saying, I'm glad that they took a stand against her, right? So we've been working with Rama on starting a chapter at Indiana University, and other groups are working with her on kind of figuring out how to approach the free speech side of this. But as you can see, it's highly concerning that students are not allowed to speak about these things. Their own university journals are silencing them. Next slide, please. So I would encourage all of you, if you as parents or your children have not seen the Hindu on Campus handle. Hindu on Campus was an initiative started this past year. We work very closely with them, and they're an amazing group that is a repository for Hinduphobia and sharing experiences from Hindu students, but it's entirely anonymous. So students from around the world, as far as South Africa, India, Malaysia, have shared stories on this handle, sharing experiences they felt harassed or discriminated against as Hindus, right? So there's plenty of stories from prospective Rutgers students who don't want to attend Rutgers after seeing a lot of the negativity that Hindu students are facing there. Next slide. And then this is, I believe this is the last slide on the Rutgers situation, but to these very stories. So just to kind of give more context, Hindu on Campus copies what a lot of other religious groups do. So the Jewish community has their own handle, and these are all very major kind of student repositories or stories that exist. So this is not some fringe group, right? Hindu on Campus works with all these other organizations like Jewish on Campus, or maybe the respective like Muslim or other organizations out there. And in response to these stories, Anna Branch actually blocked the Hindu on Campus handle. And the next slide shows who she is. Can we go to the next slide? So yeah, she is the Senior Director for Equity, and she, quote, provides strategic leadership to promote equity and inclusion in every aspect of the university. So whenever the Rutgers students have a complaint to make, they need to take it to the chancellor or anyone at the university. Anna Branch is a person that they have to speak to, and she's been on some of the calls with some of our Rutgers HSC students. She did not attend a conference that I'll share shortly that we hosted a couple months back at Rutgers. But imagine you're a student at Rutgers and you want to share some of the discrimination you felt, and it's very possible some of your stories are posted on the Hindu on Campus handle, and she's blocked your account. You know, the cards are not stacked in those students' favor when they're entering those discussions. So quite a shame. Next slide. So I'll branch into some of the other kind of Hindu-phobic elements that exist on campus. So this past year, a group called Students Against Hindutva Ideology was started on campus. Pretty dangerous group in the sense that it's mostly Ivy League focused, and it comes from a couple of students who are Hindu in name. I doubt they're very Hindu practitioner focused, but they are a group that focuses on the, it's heavily against this Hindutva ideology, as the name suggests. So next slide. Their biggest initiative was an event called Holi Against Hindutva. So the entire focus was on the NRC CAA protests, and the right, hopefully you can read it on your screen. But ever since Modi came into power, they've been focusing on revisionist brand of Hindu nationalism. What's kind of most important is the last slide, the last paragraph. It says, we invite universities and youth organizations to celebrate a Holi Against Hindutva in March of 2020. We'll ask all professors to come to predetermined public spaces dressed in white, only in one color powder for Holi, right? And they posted a lot of negativity against Holi itself. They called Holi, quote, a casteist festival that celebrates the burning of a Bahujan woman. There's a lot of rhetoric that's encoded in there that's further Hindu phobia, but imagine, that you want to celebrate Holi and you're a freshman or sophomore on campus and you're being told that this Holi is being used to protest political situations in India, right? And then Suhagji mentioned, and yes, I was going to mention that on the next slide actually, that the reason that these are all so correlated is because they don't just occur in a vacuum. Like Trashki powers Holi Against Hindutva in the same way that Holi Against Hindutva powers Trashki. So they host each other for talks, they give each other that ammunition. And actually, let's go to the next slide so you can see some of the groups involved with this. Next slide. Yeah, perfect. So the two major groups that were behind Holi Against Hindutva in terms of supporting the students are groups called Sadhana and Equality Labs. So I believe Praveenji had mentioned Equality Labs a bit earlier, and I'm sure all of you know about them through the caste resolutions that they're trying to pass on the West Coast. Sadhana is a very dangerous group where they're a New York-based group and they call themselves a coalition of progressive Hindus. So it's very dangerous because they're Hindu in name, but they support every anti-Hindu agenda that exists out there, including the fight against Trashki. They stand with Trashki. They invite her to talks. This article on the left is their statement in support of Holi Against Hindutva. So all of these groups kind of work in tandem with each other, including Trashki, including all the professors that stand with Trashki. They all provide ammunition to these things, and that gives them ammo when there's very few, professors or faculty that want to stand with kind of our agendas in terms of against Hinduphobia. It becomes very tough to show them that, look, that harassment is Hinduphobia. It's not political discourse. This is targeted attacks against students, right? Next slide. I know I'm taking a little bit too much time, so let me try to go faster. Last thing here on Sadhana, she's come out, the founder of Sadhana, Sunita Vishwanath, has come out and said publicly that campuses in the US have been completely dominated by Hindu Students Council, a Hindu right-wing outfit. They brainwashed all Hindu students. We faced stiff opposition from members of the council when we tried to engage with the Hindu students. So, it's a pretty public fight that we have in terms of getting students to recognize our agenda versus some of the nuances of Sadhana or Equality Labs. Next slide. So quick thing that we did back in April 2021, we held an Understanding Hinduphobia conference. We had about 1,000 attendees virtually. This was an academic initiative where our goal was to get the Rutgers administration to recognize that Hinduphobia exists. The goal is not necessarily, okay, let's get Audrey Truschke fired from day one, but let's build some kind of policies and practices that can guide us on how to recognize and act against Hinduphobia. I actually should have included a slide that shows the image of the resolution that the Rutgers student body passed, recognizing and standing against Hinduphobia. So it's a monumental step that happened in Rutgers this past year. All credit to the scholars here and to the Rutgers Hindu Students Council chapter, because now anytime Truschke or anyone on campus tries to do something that's Hinduphobic, there's actually formal policies in place for how the students can handle that, right? So exactly like kind of Rashmi has seen at Oxford with the university taking a stand, that can only happen if there's formal policies in place around Hinduphobia, which our students are the ones that have to fight for. Next slide. This is just a quick kind of show of how students who face Hinduphobia, this is a student who faced a very public case of Hinduphobia that you probably all saw, but don't want to expose their name, but we talked to them about HSC and what the community we have provides and our goal of being able to support them. And they came back with this message of they haven't even spoken to an Indian person in a long time at their school, right? So the biggest thing that we try to advocate for is building a community where people feel like they're not alone, right? When you know that there's other students or people like you, your age, or that grew up in this country that feel the same way you do, it gives a lot of solidarity. Next slide. So let's quickly wrap up. I'm sorry it took so much time. What are the best ways to stand up against Hinduphobia? So number one is be part of your university's Hindu organization. So students should get involved with their Hindu group or contact HSC to start one if there's not one at their school, right? So it's really important to say, at most universities, the Indian and South Asian groups are just not going to cut it in terms of the discussions they're having. They're really not going to be taking a stand against issues like this. So it really comes to the Hindu organization on campus to do that. When you just get on campus, focus on representing Hindu Dharma well, right? So remember the beauty of your tradition, show people and build alliances with other students. Focus on the beauty of the tradition, right? And when negative situations occur, you have a right as a student to stand up against that bigotry. So don't be scared to take a stand. And that really only happens as part of a community, right? So yes, you can do it on your own, but if your university doesn't have a student group, HSC will work with you or your parents or the community or whoever it might need to be in order to give you that support you need to fight Hinduphobia. Center you in that discussion, right? We don't want the credit. We want our students to be the ones getting that credit for whatever initiatives they take part of. But at the end of the day, they should have support and know that they're not alone. Next slide, please. I think the colors got messed up here, but if anyone does want to start a chapter, just visit our website. That's the QR code there, hindustudentscouncil.org. But also my email's here, and Praveenji, please feel free to share it with everyone afterwards. I'm happy to speak to any parents or students. In fact, we're starting a couple chapters on the West Coast this coming year in Santa Barbara and UC Davis, and then Stanford is also starting a chapter. So a lot of momentum on the West Coast. So I apologize once again for taking too much time. I'm sure there's going to be questions at the end.
Thank you, Arnav, very much. Your time was very well spent. I think we all need to hear this. So thank you for that. When I see people like Audrey Truschke teaching Hinduism in Rutgers, it's almost like Pope trying to teach Islam. It's literally somebody who has no interest and actually hates the religion is actually teaching that religion to our children. I simply view all these examples as a hostile learning environment. When children leave their home for the first time and are in a new environment and trying to develop their own identity, there are forces which are right there to destroy that identity to start with. So parents, please try to look at this very seriously, because this is really an attack on your child's basic identity, what they have been raised as. So I'm going to go through all of that later. So I'm going to give the stage to Raj and Surya. They have a short presentation on other forces that are on campus, which are turning or leading to this Hinduphobia. Keep in mind that what we are seeing is only a tip of the iceberg. There is a very large machinery underneath it. And Raj and Surya have put together a very great presentation in which they'll try to bring the various elements that collectively lead to so many of our own Hindu children eventually hating Hinduism after they leave college. So Raj and Surya, all yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So is our presentation on screen, or I can broadcast it as well?
Neeraj will bring it up for you.
Okay, great. So while we get that up, just thank you, Dr. Praveen, and for including me with so many very distinguished speakers. I feel a little like a nobody, but it's really great to be here. And as we get the presentation up, I can also say that, I did do Asian studies, primarily East Asian studies, up to the graduate level, primarily national security focused. And also at that time, hearing all of these stories, I find myself thinking I'm lucky that when I went to college 20 years ago, there weren't many South Asian studies departments around the country. They were concentrated in a few schools. And so where I grew up in the middle of nowhere, people generally took my word for it if they asked me what Hinduism was, and they kind of respected that. So it's ironic that with a bigger community here that we have this fault line. So with that, I think we'll get started. The intersectionality, I use this term very intentionally, and I'm going to sort of go over these three sort of key areas to sort of express like what I perceive as to be sort of the modern 2021 phenomenon of Hinduphobia, where we have, old prejudices and tropes, which we'll get into in a second. We also have a lot of fault lines. India is a very pluralistic, diverse society. There are all sorts of, people who have all sorts of agendas. And there's also academics and intellectuals. And specifically, when we talk about the academics and intellectuals, it is addressing sort of the points raised earlier, which is why is it that such, really blatantly, prejudicial, statements and actions, by institutions that we're a part of, educational institutions, companies even, why is it tolerated? And why is it so hard to kind of fight back intellectually, when you deal in sort of these environments? So I think with that, we'll get into kind of these details in a second. So we'll go on to sort of just kind of going over some of the prejudices and tropes that still are with us. And you will see as we go on that they sort of persist and are just dressed up in sort of more modern, more contemporary language to suit the audience that they're going for. So we can go to the next slide, and then I'll let Surya kind of go over this, the tropes that, Hindus are problematic. Next slide, please.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Sinha, for this fantastic discussion. I think it's exceptionally important that parents and students alike really are able to delve into the details as to exactly what the genesis of this Hinduphobia really is. And that's kind of why I'd like to cover some of the prejudices, tropes, and exactly where they actually come from. When we look at some of the prejudices, we see them really rooted in old colonial times, and what we see today is a neo-colonial form of representing India and Hinduism in that fashion, as they did more than 100 years ago. Except it's wrapped in wokeism, in an idea where there is a select group of people who have a higher moral authority, who understand morality to a higher degree than anyone else, and are able to tell the rest of the world, and especially the people who come from India or people of specifically Hindu heritage and Hindu background, to say that your morality is somehow lower, and I can tell you why, because you have A, B, C flaws. Now, prejudices, if you see, the first thing that typically they go to is caste. And without understanding the ideas of jati, varna, without understanding them in the context of the colonial history that we had, the Mughal period, and even the pre-Mughal period. There's very little understanding of history and where India's social structure actually fit into this to preserve certain economic constructs, which I think in many ways were important to India's identity itself. While nobody is trying to discuss past in a positive light in the modern sense, looking at it in the past to understand what it really was and why it existed is equally important. But that's something that is not the purpose of pushing this prejudice. The idea is to show that the Indian culture is inherently bigoted, unequal, and doesn't treat members of society on the same footing. Other tropes typically tend to go, I don't know if you could go to the next slide, please. Yes, the other tropes typically go through the fault. They divide India by by ethnicity, by language, and essentially try and show that the country was never one country, it was never a civilization. It was essentially a group of warring tribes, as they like to say, who kind of have been amalgamated together under one country, which doesn't necessarily need to sustain in the long run. And the Balkanization of India is in fact something that is really it's center stage in Western academic thought, unfortunately, and they use and I won't say the entire Western academic thought, but amongst those who are a part of the postmodernist and post-structuralist community, which unfortunately is the majority that we see today, this is quite central. So they try and divide people by caste, by religion, by region and ethnicity, and say that this country doesn't necessarily have to be together. And the only thing that is stitching it together is the fact that it came together against the British and against colonialism. Otherwise, it would never be a nation. If we could just go to the next slide, please.
So great. So, as Surya just mentioned, it is, there are some kind of changes in sort of the way that sociology, area studies, ethnic studies that they view. And one of the major influences has been critical theory. You may have heard of it in the news recently as critical race theory. That's derivative philosophy that has kind of become a bit of a controversy in the education with parents and educators, being taught in schools. But really what the relevance to this discussion is that, critical pedagogy, for example, there is a blending of academia and activism. So it is not enough for the professor to just teach. They also need to change. They need to actively is the key word. It is not enough to be not racist. It is important to be anti-racist. You must actively identify and dismantle sources of oppression. And so this is something that really came out of an American experience. If you look at critical race theory specifically, this is about the fact that we had a civil rights movement, and yet we had persisting racial disparities and prejudices. And so it is not simply enough to say, oh, I'm not racist, or I'm not, I don't want to marginalize people. You need to actively challenge the structures to do that. Now, what happens is rhetorically, in an India or a South Asian studies context, say like Audrey Trushki's department, is there's a grafting of this narrative that has been sort of developed in America, where you equate, say, Indian Hindus, especially the general category, I guess, in the Indian census, or so-called upper caste, and to white people. And Indian, can we just go back one second, to kind of the African-American or even indigenous community. And if we go to the next slide, actually, yeah, we can go now. You'll see kind of how this plays out. So, I'll read this quote out. Just guess who, try to take a guess who said this. And so you'll say, now on the other side of the world, a dominant caste woman in India was presuming the same privilege in a parallel universe. In American social justice circles, her castigation of the Dalit woman would be seen as a kind of Brahmin-splaining. And if you're familiar, if you've read American media, you've probably heard of white-splaining, mansplaining. And so you see kind of here how this was sort of grafted on. And if you go to the next slide, you will find out that this is actually from a book that was highly recommended by Oprah called Caste, The Origin of Her Discontent. It was sent to multiple company CEOs. Cisco Systems, their VP of HR, actually endorsed it on his website. And the way I would kind of characterize the book was, it's really about African Americans, but they're sort of using Indians and Hinduism as a plot device. We're sort of characters. They're not really concerned with the details. And if you kind of go back even to colonial times, a lot of times this was the case. And so this gives you an idea of like how these tropes can kind of slip in, undetected. We go to the next slide. So one of the things that, was very, and Arnav kind of, touched on this as well, is that when you oppose this, because of sort of the academic theoretical background, your opposition, your resistance to these types of tropes is actually perceived as evidence of your complicity, of your casteism, of your privilege. And so when they teach students, and again, remember I mentioned that there's sort of a blending of academia and activism. It is not enough to simply, learn about something. You must actively work to dismantle, an oppressive structure. And so, for example, they might encourage South Asian or Indian American students to go home and talk to their parents about their anti-Blackness, about their privilege. And again, when you talk about, say, racism, it is not enough to just oppose racism, you must actively oppose it. And so if you graph that on to an Indian, American, or a Hindu context, that would be, you must actively oppose casteism. You must actively oppose Hindutva and Brahminical patriarchy. And so that would also explain, why is it that, you hear these tropes, you go to the administrators, they're like, well, you're a privileged group. Hindu phobia, you're a privileged upper caste people. So how can you possibly be the victim of any type of racism? That's kind of what gets in their heads. Go to the next slide. And so, before, say, like 20 years ago, for example, when I was in school, occasionally I'd read these things, but it's like, whatever, big deal. But really now what's changed, and also what kind of motivated me to get more involved, was that this actually has practical impacts on the policies, on the companies you work for, the educational institutions you attend, and even your community. So if you look at, and we'll go into this, further on, but essentially what you will see is all of these kind of social justice, academically backed tropes are, all of this is used to dress up pretty much the same old anti-Hindu things that we've been seeing for the last 200 years in the Western media discourse. But they, dressed up in social justice terms, they use privilege, oppression, all of these things. And so when you go to a decision maker at a university or, anywhere who has sort of an American background and has an American academic training, they're going to just read it and say like, oh yeah, absolutely. We want to be actively opposing all forms of discrimination and oppression. And so without really thinking about it, they end up inadvertently taking actions that target and potentially marginalize and treat us like a suspect class. So I'll let Surya wrap it up with his remarks, but thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak.
I'll just make a few comments before I get to this slide specifically. In conclusion, I personally believe that it's important that parents and students really see what Hindu phobia is. I see that it's a tool for neocolonialism, and I think Satish Sharmaji will be talking about this in detail. The universities actually act as gatekeepers of knowledge. And the reason that they act as gatekeepers of knowledge is that there's a democratization of education that's taking place. And universities that hold a reputation, they need to remain relevant. And they use their reputation to incubate certain ideas within their four walls. And those ideas are often funded by people from vested interest groups from around the world who fund research scholars who come in to do very specific sorts of work. And that work is meant for being cited by the media, being published by various publishers. We have seen this in the case of Bloomsbury, Penguin, several cases, both in India and abroad, where media, the universities, publishers, have all worked in lockstep to make sure that a certain narrative is propagated. And equally, other narratives, especially the Indic narrative, is shut out and also deemed revisionist. When anything is deemed revisionist, just by the virtue of throwing that word at it, it is discarded and pushed to the right. Just as how earlier in the discussion we were talking about how Hindu student groups are deemed right-wing, any narrative that any Hindu student would like to put forward, or any Hindu academic who would like to try and correct a colonial narrative would like to say those people are deemed revisionist and therefore fascist and a bunch of other words that go with it. And it's a multi-pronged attack. It comes with the complicity of Indian media outlets that work in tandem with international media outlets from the New York Times to Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. Literally, I can go on and name journalists, very specific journalists who are bureau chiefs in Delhi and in Washington, who will continue, and in London, who will continue to push a certain narrative. And the auto-suggestion on top of this is done by big tech. If you look at Instagram, you look at Google. When any student goes onto Google to do a bit of research to find out, academic papers that they could cite, what shows up in the first 10, 20 searches? It is primarily a search list which is curated to suit the Anglo-spheric space, right? So you will see the narrative being tightly controlled, and I really encourage students to really be very discerning when they go through with their research and be fully aware of what exactly is going on in media, academia, think tanks, and in the publishing space. And I'd like, I guess, Dr. Sudhir Sharma would be able to talk about this more in detail. So I'd like to hand it over from here. Thank you, Dr. Sinha, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Surya. For those of you who may have come late, I just want to reintroduce Surya and Raj. I'm going to give you a brief introduction. I met them both on Clubhouse. They are highly eloquent and highly informed speakers, and I heard them multiple times, and that was the reason I invited them. And just to give you a slight angle to this, yesterday Surya's account on Clubhouse was suspended. I've never seen Surya use any language except a very gentle and a very, respectful language. But there are social media tropes who, in large numbers, reported him because they did not like what he was saying. So keep in mind that this is not isolated. There are groups which collectively work in tandem to make sure certain outcomes are achieved. So Surya, who had over 2,500 followers, is down to 50 at this time. And he has to rebuild his indie club, which had got extremely good speakers and very good rooms held, which were very academic and very thoughtful. They're all gone now. So this is how some of these systems work. I'm working hard to see how we can restore his account back, but these things are not easy to do, as you may have seen in the case of Twitter. I'm just going to go back to one small thing before we go to Suhag, is that I was the president of Indian Student Association at Carnegie Mellon when I was a graduate student. I connected with their Facebook page when I had a Facebook account, which I don't have anymore. And when the Black Lives Movement was happening, I started seeing a document which looked exactly as if it came from a toolkit. The document was very simple. It was basically an indoctrination document put together by two Indian students who were being educated and have thoroughly been believed in the narrative that is coming out from that. And the idea was very simple. The document was intended for them to read, learn how to talk to their parents, to convince them that they are racist, they are colorist, in addition to belonging to religion, which oppresses its own people. And because they're Brahmin, they have a privilege and they need to understand and acknowledge those factors. This document has been widely circulated among the Indian student associations at most US universities, and I'll be sending you a copy of that in an email after this meeting is over with the people who registered. So without getting any further, I'll hand it over to Suhag, who will very eloquently explain to you exactly what these narratives really mean and what do they mean in the legal context. So Suhag, it's all yours. Thank you.
Pravinji, can you please introduce Suhagji, please, again?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
I can introduce myself. It's okay. I can introduce myself.
You can do a better job than I can. So thank you. Go ahead, Suhag.
I'll do a shorter version, hopefully. Namaste, everyone. I'm Suhag Shukla. I'm a co-founder and executive director of the Hindu American Foundation. I am a second-generation Hindu American, born and raised in primarily the San Francisco Bay Area. And now I am the mother of a college graduate as well as a sophomore, rising sophomore in college. So the topic today is one that really hits home. The Hindu American Foundation is an advocacy organization. We were established in 2003. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have 13 full-time staff working on issues impacting the Hindu American community and Hindus globally. We focus on two primary areas, education and advocacy. Our education work deals with improving how Hinduism and Indian history and other things are taught primarily in K through 12 textbooks, which many of you may have familiarity with in terms of the stereotyped ways in which our history and our traditions are presented. Also in working with the media to not just dispel stereotypes, but also work in a proactive manner and provide them resources so that we're not always on the back foot. Our advocacy focus is on protecting civil rights and in the United States, working on hate crimes prevention, and also highlighting human rights atrocities against Hindu minorities, primarily throughout South Asia. So we interact with think tanks, with members of Congress, with the executive branch, both at the federal level as well as what we've been seeing lately is federal and foreign policy issues becoming part of city council proceedings, which really have no place. Cities need to be focusing on fixing potholes and making sure that local infrastructure is there to support the local needs of the community. So thank you to the Indian Americans of Irvine and Orange County for hosting this important conversation. We've heard a lot about Hinduphobia, and so I want to make it a little bit practical. I'm a lawyer, so I'm always looking for tools to take these kind of more esoteric concepts and make them practical so that they are useful to either fight injustice or to bring about relief. And so what I'm going to quickly go over is two things. First, how do you recognize Hinduphobia? I think if we maybe go back and count the number of times we've said Hinduphobia during our conversation, it's probably going to get into the hundreds. But you know, if you're not eating, drinking these issues, as I do, it's my full-time career, how are we as parents supposed to be able to recognize Hinduphobia? So next, if we could get my deck up. All right, thank you. Next slide. I'm going to make my starting place where Arnav and others from their conference on Hinduphobia at Rutgers kind of gave this amazing working definition of Hinduphobia, and that's the place that I'm going to start. So I'm not going to read it out loud in the interest of time, but if you have a working definition of Hinduphobia, it's great in an academic sense that now the university was able to build off a policy off of it and support the students. Students are better empowered to use this definition, but I want to break this definition down a little bit more to make it practical for both parents and students to be able to not just understand and recognize Hinduphobia when it occurs, but also not succumb to it. And even if you're up to it, fight against it and advocate against it. So the reason it's important, I think, to break down a definition is it's not good enough to think, well, I'll know it when I see it, because it does not provide us kind of an objective way in which we can present the facts and leave out the emotion, even though these issues can be deeply emotional. So the two elements that really popped out to me when I looked at this working definition were intent and impact. You can see where I'm a lawyer by training, so some of that does color the way that I view different issues. But I want to go into a little bit of what intent and impact means. Impact is a little bit easier to recognize. Has a particular statement, does a particular quote, does a particular professor's actions instill prejudice, fear, or hatred against Hindus? Does it delegitimize the concerns of Hindus? Does it demonize us? Does it otherize us? Does it reduce some of our current concerns or minimize them or erase them? Those are all the types of impacts that we're going to see on your students, as well as people in the workplace and a number of other places that we're seeing Hinduphobia. Intent is a little bit harder because intent is something that's happening inside. It's not necessarily going to be overt. But the way that intent can manifest is either it's an aversion or dislike of Hinduism and Hindus. It could be an intent of not wanting Hindus to exist, not wanting Hinduism to exist. Or it might be derogatory, meaning that there's a fundamental disrespect for Hinduism. Next slide. So how do we understand intent even further? Well, intent can be, as I said, it's happening inside someone's heads, but what are the kinds of things that might be motivating one of these negative intents? And there's two things that it boils down to: motive and context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those, and then I'm going to shift a little bit to some resources that will empower you as parents and as well as students who are listening to be able to better recognize Hinduphobia and fight against it. So with intent, and I think that Surya and Raj really covered a lot of this in their great presentation on what are the motivating factors. There's religious exclusivism and supremacy. When you come from a worldview where there's only one way and every other way needs to be converted or demolished, those are the types of motives that might lead to someone having an intent to harm Hindus. Racism, colonialism, which I know Satishji will probably talk a lot about, Marxism, which we heard, critical theory is kind of wrapped in a lot of these Marxist frameworks and ways of kind of seeing the world as just two groups. You either are oppressed or you're an oppressor. And you can see how Hindus are very quickly, in spite of our history, being cast as oppressors only. And modernity, this idea that time always progresses towards something bigger and better. And so anything that's old and ancient is retrograde. Anything that's modern is quote unquote scientific. So those are some of the motives. Next slide. I also want to talk about context, because context is very important. Who's perpetuating Hindu phobia? We heard about external actors. These are oftentimes motivated by religious supremacy, religious exclusivism, and racism. And, you know, these external forces can also be seen as kind of as vertical hostility. And the reason is that a lot of this is coming from the West and Abrahamic societies, where large swaths of the world essentially has been colonized. And so as a result of colonization from the past 1500 years, they still have in their hands access to wealth and power. So we don't have necessarily access to the media. We don't have access to academia, at least in the realms where a lot of this Hindu phobia is being perpetuated through academic study and now through scholar activism. Of course, we have a lot of academics in medicine, in business, and other things, but in the area that we have not begun, or we're not as present, this is where we're seeing a lot of those things. So that's kind of vertical and external hostility. But I think what's really concerning also is what's coming in through internal forces. These are people eating our own, essentially. You have other professors, other journalists of Indian origin with, who claim to be Hindu, and, maybe they have a personal practice, but their politics are such that it motivates them to want to ascribe certain political ideologies or association with what's going on in India with people who are in the diaspora who may not know anything about it. And so that is what we would call a horizontal hostility, because it's happening from within. And so I just want to kind of give that overarching framework that, we talked about the professor from Rutgers, and she would very clearly fit in the external realm. But if you go, and we'll talk a little bit later about that Hindutva harassment field guide, if you look at a lot of those names, they're coming from within our larger community. And I think that that's important to recognize, and for students to know that just because a professor is of Indian origin, you still need to be discerning about what are they teaching me, what might their political ideology be, and doing their own research and learning, because that's really what college is all about, is exploration. Next slide. So even if you have a framework of thinking through intent, impact, and all of that, it's still not easy necessarily. We've seen a lot of overt examples of Hindu phobia that Arnav had presented, as well as what Rashmi faced and what Raj and Surya presented. But what we did at the Hindu American Foundation is also create a glossary. And when you start looking at the Hindutva harassment field guide, it's a mouthful, you'll see, I feel that it was in some sense a response to this glossary. When we did the social media campaign around our glossary, guess what it did? It unleashed a whole bunch of Hinduphobia, therein proving the point that Hinduphobia is real, in spite the fact that the harassment guide actually tries to deny it. So I would encourage you to come to this resource, which is there. And next slide. What it does is it points out certain terms that on the whole may not necessarily strike you or even your, Korean neighbor or your Caucasian colleague as Hinduphobic. And what we've tried to do is provide not just a definition, but the context or the history of a term and why it might be Hinduphobic or considered Hinduphobic in certain contexts. Our hope is that this empowers parents, people on the ground who might see an article that has Hinduphobia, to be able to use this sort of language, to have consistency, to be able to articulate why something is wrong and to call it out. So I would encourage people to use this. I'm going to quickly shift now to Hinduphobia on campus. Next slide. Sorry, I'm really rushing through this, but I want there to be enough time for questions at the end. But we know that so much of Indian history and Hinduism has been taught through a colonial lens. One of the most important things that you as parents can do is learn the tradition and our history yourselves. As a parent, I can say that you cannot, learning about this is not a drop-off activity. You have to be actively engaged. You have to practice what you preach, because our kids are learning more from our actions than they are by what we're telling them. And so learn together. This is what my parents and I did. When I asked questions growing up, like, why do we do this? Why do we do this? They didn't know, because they grew up in India. There was no need to necessarily question. It was part of tradition. There was part of community. And so you were imbibed with the tradition and the philosophy. But they said, hey, let's learn this together. And I think that all of that not only makes us, more informed and able to defend ourselves, but our tradition is such that it is built on being a quest for truth, and to make us be able to control our mind and control our emotions, to be able to live a life of equanimity and balance, and to ultimately be happy. And that's what we all want, not just for ourselves, but for our children. So you can also arm yourself with knowledge, and that's really important. If you don't know where to start, and if you have not gone to a Bal Vihar, and I have to say that just because your children went to Bal Vihar is not necessarily insurance that your kids are going to succumb. Many of the activists who have written articles against some of our work at the foundation are former Bal Vihar students. So again, it's not a drop-off activity. Talk to your children. You can go to HAF's website. We have a Hinduism 101 that's actually intended for non-Hindus, because it's something that we use in the K through 12 context. But many parents have found it to be a very good starting point to give kind of a view of Hinduism from the 30,000-foot view, because oftentimes we know our Sampradayak or our Guru Shishya lineage understanding of Hinduism, the teachings and the philosophies and the practices, but this provides them kind of that overarching view. I'm going to make kind of it may sound like a silly suggestion, but the Idiot's Guide to Hinduism is actually a very good resource as a starting point. So that's a quick and easy book. It's no book I'm going to say is a perfect book. So, there are things that you might find in there that you can have conversations about, but that's my go-to graduation gift for every high school student that I know is going to be going on to college. And then of course there's the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, it's not just a manual for life, but it's a good place to have conversations about our values. And that way, I think, rather than telling children what to do, we're explaining why and how. And in turn, I think deepening our relationships with our children. Next slide. So I'm not going to talk too much about the harassment guide, but the problem with these guides, as Professor Sinha mentioned, is that when children are exposed to this, one, it's going to silence them. Why would you want to openly talk on campus if you're afraid that someone's going to view you as being anti-Dalit, anti-Muslim, or anti-LGBT, which the LGBT thing, all of it, it's just so silly considering the tradition and what our tradition teaches about the divine's presence in all of existence. And so having those conversations will hopefully help you build that relationship and have tackled some of these conversations ahead of time. Next slide. I'm going to just quickly jump to caste, and I know Satishji will be talking about this a lot, and Pravinji touched upon this, that we have seen an explosion of caste being inserted into campus policy, into county policy, into company policy, and also into the law. HAF is involved at every level. So we have a third-party motion filed in a case that the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing filed against Cisco over a claim of alleged caste-based discrimination. We believe that existing law should provide anyone who's faced any form of discrimination justice. But what California has done is it's gone a step further by trying to define caste and a caste system as something that's inherently part of the Hindu tradition, and one that the tradition and our teachings legally and religiously mandate us to be bigoted, essentially. And so we are viewing that as a violation of the First Amendment because the US Constitution forbids the state to define religious doctrine, and that's what they're doing. On campuses, the CSU state, what happened there, the same activists that we've talked about earlier were able to successfully get the students to draft a resolution to portray caste-based discrimination as something that's widespread, and for the university to legislate against it. Now, what does caste do? There's already things like ancestry, national origin, that would cover if anyone were facing something like caste-based discrimination. Current policy and law would already cover that. When you ask a government body or a college campus or college-wide system in this case to add caste as a specific category, what it's going to do is it's going to singularly mark, because of the singular association with caste and India and South Asians or Hindus specifically, it's going to actually mark all students of Indian and South Asian descent and faculty members as a suspect class, which in and of itself is discriminatory. So these are things that I know that Professor Sinha was very active in pushing back against at the Cal State system. While it passed the student body, it did not come up for markup at the academic council. So the state body, or rather the Cal State system, works similar to how a democracy works. First, it has to pass a lower house, then it passes the upper house, then it gets written into law by the executive branch, which would be the board of trustees or the administration. So it got stopped at the academic level. We don't know if it's going to get pushed any further, but I know that Professor Sinha is leading the charge along with Professor Sunil Kumar to ensure that this doesn't happen. If existing law and policy already would protect students against all forms of discrimination, why do you need to create a category without any evidence, by the way? So read the Carnegie report if you haven't, to see what sort of false evidence all of these policies are being pushed on. How does it impact your relationship? Well, whether it's caste policies and the activism that's going on campuses to push these types of policies, or it's the academic scholarship that's coming out, or the scholar activism, it's going to pit our children against us, because we are being framed as inherently racist, inherently casteist, retrograde, backwards, bigoted. And, you know, children, I know I was a rebellious teen. It's almost like, you know, it's like a ripe field in that sense to take advantage of that. College is a time when children are trying to break out and explore their identities. And they want to in some way reject what maybe they felt was imposed on them. So it's so important for both parents and students to be aware of all of this for that very reason. I'll talk a little bit later about our ongoing defamation suit. Audrey Treschke is one of the defendants. I also want to talk a little bit, because Professor Sinha had specifically asked me to do this before I end, and that is, there is a huge difference between preference, prejudice, and discrimination. And all of these things are getting conflated. Preference, what is that? I like chocolate ice cream. You might like vanilla. My preference might be that, hey, I wanted to marry someone who is Hindu so that we could raise our children as Hindus. You might have a preference for linguistic background or whatever. Those are preferences. Where prejudice comes into the picture is where it's an irrational attitude of hostility, or you're holding preconceived judgments about someone or holding adverse opinions about them without giving them a chance, giving an individual a chance to show who they really are. Discrimination is limited to a legal framework. There are laws in place, policies in place, whether we're talking about federal law, state law, campus policy, or company policy, where you cannot act out against someone on the basis of their race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. And then there's also age and disability, ancestry at the state level, all of these things. And I think it's important to know that distinction, because it's getting conflated in a way that if you express a preference, say as a parent or even as a student, and someone immediately says, oh, you're being discriminatory, I think we need to know what the difference is, because all humans have preferences. And as long as we're not holding our preferences and mistreating others or acting against others based on prejudices, we're just simply being human. So with that, I will end my remarks.
Thank you, Suhag, very much for clarifying these terms that can often create confusion, and people start beating themselves up for something that they may be doing, but not necessarily constitute what we call discrimination. So I will not take too much time, and I'll move on to Pandit Satish Sharma ji. I would love to hear from him. I've heard him on Clubhouse, a very eloquent speaker and educator. So Pandit ji, the time is all yours. Please go ahead.
Ramji, namaskar, and thank you very much, Dr. Sinha ji, for taking up this initiative. And Suhag ji, wonderful contribution. One of the biggest difficulties that we found in the United Kingdom was the complete absence of a vocabulary and a concept set with which to defend our position. And it's lovely to hear the precision with which you have expanded and developed that particular requirement so well. So we will happily make use of all of your hard work on that. Right, so I will try and move through very, very quickly. I appreciate that we've had a fair amount of time on this issue. Let me share one context setting perspective. I've been in the United Kingdom for the best part of 55 years now. And so I'm very familiar with the manner in which the British establishment works, the manner in which the Church of England works, and also the reality of what it is to be a Hindu in Britain. Having said all of that, I was stunned and shocked in 2013 at the manner in which the entire establishment, in an integrated, concerted effort, completely turned against us. This was not an accident of understanding. This was not data being misunderstood. This was an act of violence against a completely innocent community in this regard. And it really took me by surprise. I often say to people that I'm the most reluctant activist. I'm certainly not a person who had any intention or desire to participate in the public sphere, but it became an existential issue for us. And having understood, after having a great deal of scrutiny, having understood that this was not an issue that was going to go away, that this was an issue that was going to undermine 3 generations of societal, cultural, and community investment in the United Kingdom, that this was an issue that even after I was long gone, was going to potentially plague our Hindu children for generations to come. It became apparent that we had to deal with this. We had to understand what was going on and then challenge it in a manner that we didn't want. I understood that we didn't need to get to the stage where we were starting this process. We didn't need to get to a stage where we'd educated them and they'd acknowledged us. I recognized this was a threat, and I recognized that we needed to defeat this assault. It was not a question of misunderstanding or anything like that. It was a question of deliberate violence. The challenge for us was that we had to develop not just an academic strategy. I understood that we also had to develop a legal strategy because it was to do with legislation. But most of all, we had to develop and execute a political strategy so that the policymakers could be made aware of what it was they were doing and the consequences of their actions and their choices. But the toughest aspect of it was that we needed to develop a community strategy. You know, we have a completely tranquil community who are happy doing their 9 to 5, doing their businesses, being doctors, being educators, being financiers in the city, etc. And the vast majority of our community are not still not in the professional sphere. They're just decent, straightforward, simple people running corner shops and perhaps doing relatively unsophisticated occupations, unsophisticated in terms of legalese, in terms of government policy. That was a massive challenge for us. So having taken into account all of those, oh my goodness, well, thank you very much for jumping to my slides. I hadn't intended to get there quite yet, but having taken into account all of those requirements, I then started to study who it was that we were needing to challenge, who it was we were needing to educate, and who it was we were needing to defeat. To show you how severe and how hostile the establishment had become, the government requested the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. They're the custodians of equality legislation and process in this country. The government instructed them to conduct a community consultation, and they appointed academics to oversee the process. The EHRC took that to hand and said, right, we have got a list of academics, and they appointed them to conduct this. We had a look at the academics, and without exception, every single one of the academics had published works which had already prejudged our community and defined us as being casteist, had already decided that we were inherently intrinsically discriminators. And this is the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. On 4th of March 2013, there were speeches made in the House of Lords, and they are horrific. Remember, 2013, we're now almost 10 years down the road. And when we look at the manner and the speed with which even the tiniest misstatement can be construed as being hurtful and offensive, from that perspective, if you view the speeches that were made in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, you would sit back speechless. The manner in which everybody of every tradition alleged that this was Hindu, that it was intrinsic to our community, that there were half of the British Hindu population desperately in need of saving from their own Hindu brethren, and that the honorable lords and the legislators, they had no obligation, they had no opportunity, no, they had an obligation to intervene to save Her Majesty's subjects. It was terrible. It was an exercise in vilification on a scale I had never anticipated nor encountered. So all of the institutions and the structures of state were loaded against us. They had already come to a decision without ever having consulted the party who were deemed to be offensive. We had already been found guilty prior to even having an opportunity to establish our innocence. I had understood that there was racism and discrimination for our community, obviously. I have a memory of the days when my father came to this country as a very educated man, was denied any professional occupation. In fact, the only occupation that he was able to do was as a bus conductor, because even bus drivers had to be white, because brown people didn't have a brain that was capable of conducting a vehicle at speeds in excess of 30 miles an hour. This was established policy at the time. So I knew that there was an uphill battle, but I hadn't realized it was still so prevalent and so entrenched. So we sat back and decided we need to sort this out. One other thing that came to my mind was that we needed to deal with this so that it didn't rear its head again in 4 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 11, 12, 15 years' time. You know, as volunteers, we are already so heavily invested in constructing well-being for our own community, but also the host communities where we live. And so having to do this again regularly was something that was a potential problem. So we stepped back, understood what needed to be done, and started to formulate a strategy. One thing I think that we began to get clarity on And I would really recommend that our Hindu students understand this principle. As a community, we moved from a state of tolerance, where we were an unpleasant but present fact of the United Kingdom's societal landscape. But we were tolerated because we were contributing to the exchequer and to the demands of as labor. We were being exploited. So we understood the difference between being tolerated and being exploited. And then we moved to a stage of being appreciated. And that's very nice to be appreciated, isn't it? But we understood that being appreciated is also not being respected and certainly not being given the position of equals. Remember, even a slave master appreciates the labor of slaves. And yet we very happily tend to acknowledge appreciation as a mark of equality. That's not the case. So our children really need to understand that no matter how much we're appreciated, it's still a big leap to get to the stage where you're respected as equals. And I would submit that we have not got to that stage in any European country yet. So this was the background that we were in. We had to reconstruct the language, we had to understand the concepts, we had to be able to phrase it in a manner that the legislators would understand, but also in a manner that our community could understand. The vast majority of our community did not recognize the threat that this issue proposed. And so we had to find out a way of doing that. I understood, for whatever reason, I have no idea why, but I could see that we were being lured into a civilizational killing ground, that a framework had been constructed, and that we were being lured and invited to engage within this framework, and that the outcome was predetermined. And being a little bit familiar with how strategy works, I determined that what we needed to do was to create our own framework. And in our own framework, we would be able to question the morality and indeed the right to be able to leverage charges against us by those who has assumed the moral high ground. And I would recommend that this particular strand of the strategy is something that all of you should actually seriously consider. To put it bluntly, a bully will keep pummeling you as long as you don't strike back and challenge his right to pummel you. And that's what we also managed to do. So all of these needed to be done. They needed to be done by volunteers who are very busy, and they needed to do it in a manner that it would be successful, but also establish a boundary which would not be transgressed in times to come. And I would say that we achieved the objective. We defeated the amendment which had been introduced to introduce caste as a protected characteristic into equality legislation. But we also managed to portray clearly the lack of credentials of those who wanted to bring this charge against us. And that was a fundamentally important thing we needed to do. It involved us becoming aggressive, assertive, and comfortably acknowledging that our stance was going to be harmful to those who had presented this legislation against us. It's not something that generally Hindus we will want to do, but it's an absolute necessity to recognize that that was a fundamental part of what we needed to do. So we formulated the language, we expedited it, and we achieved a modicum of success, but it wasn't complete. And even to this day, we haven't yet managed to get the definition of caste out of legislation. In the notes to the Equalities Act, there is still an assertion that caste is something peculiar to the Hindu community. And it's defined as something which is hereditary, hierarchical, and endogamous. Those notes are still there. We have the curious situation where Parliament passed legislation, but the government of the day chose not to enact it. And that's because our political strategy was also effective in achieving that. It'll be concluded when the government removes those notes and removes that intention to legislate completely. And we're hoping that'll happen in a very short space of time within the lifetime of the current Parliament. But here are some ideas I'd like to share with you, which indicate the approach that we took. So Neelaji, if I may have the slide. So I want to set this in context. Suddenly, you know, we as Hindus are finding ourselves as existent in a strangely hostile world. It's a world that we went into with the best of intentions, and as Hindus and Dharmiks, we are civilization builders. So why is it that the world where we are building civilization has suddenly turned so hostile towards us? Next slide, please. So my objective was to better understand the world. To do this, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to use the example of this whole caste issue to bring to the forefront certain parameters, certain influences, and certain forces which are very much present. The slides will make available, so I'm going to romp through at a fair old pace. So I'm using the example of our experience with caste to demonstrate some of the principles. And I also want to clearly identify those who benefit from nourishing and sustaining the relentless vilification of Hindus. Next slide, please. Next one, sorry. Yeah, great. So what I decided to do was I decided also to educate the British citizenry, the British community in who we are, where we came from, and to set a larger context. And for the best part of 18,000 years, we have a continuous civilization, and it's a civilization which has successfully elevated humanity to be able to conceive and have vision of things like Yoga Bhyas, Yoga Darshans, the 6 darshans of our tradition, an amazing library of literature which is peerless and still unrivaled. And we have done this without violence and without oppression, without seeking to dominate and expand the range of resources available to us. All of this changed in a tiny little period, and the tiny little period is the 1400 period at the fag end of the previous century and the last century. And in that period, a number of things happened to us. And that period is what I wanted to focus on. Next slide, please. So as part of what happened to us in that period, British arrived, we had the Turkish Islamists who arrived, but there was something peculiar about the British supremacists. And that was that they determined not only to loot and rape and steal and to deconstruct a civilization, they also determined to erase all evidence of what they had done. And in order to erase that, they needed to recreate a historical record of every civilization they visited and replace the indigenous civilization's own understanding of its own identity. I mean, these are etchings from that time, and you can see their version of justice was a white woman with a sword and hacking through a throng of brown-skinned folk. And look at the demeanor and look at the ferocity. That was their understanding of justice. So if I look at the slide on the right-hand side, the etching, this is from the front cover of Punch magazine. And you can see, again, Victoria being portrayed. And this is India at her feet, on bent knee, seeking guidance and seeking saving. This was the mindset that visited Bharat in that period of when Bharat was covered by dark clouds. Next slide, please. This mind wasn't peculiar just to Bharat. This is the same mind that then exported those supremacist ideologies right across the globe. And this was a particular policy. In 1879, this fellow, Captain Pratt, enough said, kill the Indian, save the man, was actually a policy. And this was the policy behind the horrors which are now being unveiled about the indigenous residential schools. Next slide, please. That mindset went all the way across to Australia. And in the up until the 1960s, brown-skinned indigenous people were classed as part of the animal and plant kingdom. And persona non grata actually meant that by dogma, by doctrine, they were not deemed to be complete persons. That's actually what persona non grata meant. Next slide, please. So this was the mindset that arrived in Bharat. And I managed in my research to find quite a bit of material from that time. And some of these are quotations from the missionaries who were part of this mindset. And they made some incredible remarks. One of them was this remark: amongst the pagans themselves, we believe there is no obstacle next to the love of sin so formidable to the reception of Christianity as caste. They identified that the existence of a caste system was a threat to their missionary activities. They were not able to actually convert people because of this thing called caste. Next slide, please. Here is something that Reverend Roberts wrote. He referred to caste as this wonderful institution of India. Next slide, please. And it was clear that this thing called caste, his descriptions were such that this thing called caste refers to what we call jati. It was completely self-contained, integrated occupation and guild-based communities who had their own deity, their own form of worship, etc. And they couldn't break them. So they needed to find a way of undermining the whole concept of jatis and the skills that were passed on from generation to generation. Those remarks on the previous page were in 1844 and slightly earlier. By 1911, a census was being conducted, and Middleton, who is a British Indian government administrator, he made these remarks: "We deplore the caste system and its effect on social economic problems, but we are largely responsible for the systems we deplore." He further quoted at the end of it that which amongst the aristocratic castes really was very fluid under indigenous rule. So there was movement between jatis, as we would say, and there was movement between varnas. And this is a person of the oppressing power who was actually making these remarks. Next slide, please. He also pointed out, "I have intended pointing out that there is a very wide revolt against the classification of occupational castes, that these castes have been largely manufactured and almost entirely preserved as separate castes by the British government." Please continue, next slide. There was an incredible conference, 4th of January 1844, where a whole bunch of missionary tribes gathered, and they came to find a strategy with which to defeat and to deconstruct this very, very resistant structure that Bharat had, something that they too called this incredible, wonderful system of India. And he started his delivery by acknowledging that next to the love of sin, caste is a great barrier in India betwixt the pagans and Christ. So we've already, sorry, next slide, please. We've already demonstrated the presence of a horrific group of people wreaking havoc on indigenous civilizations all over the world. I successfully managed to demonstrate the existence of a desire, a malicious desire to deconstruct a wonderful integrated system of societal organization. And then I also had to delve into where did the Dalits come from, what did Dr. Ambedkar find, and so on and so forth. And Dr. Ambedkar acknowledged that Varna, as the Vedic system, is nothing to do with caste. It's a separate system altogether. And he acknowledged this in his speech, Annihilation of Caste. Next slide, please. So stepping back, I wanted to understand the strategy that was being leveraged against us by these people, the inheritors of all of the proceeds of criminal acts of almost 280 years. And Goebbels's philosophy of propaganda fits completely. I don't want to read all of them, but in principle, you polarize, you reduce everything into diametrically opposite understandings, you continuously discredit the opposition, you manipulate the consensus as value for your own purposes, and the rule of unanimity, continuously presenting one's viewpoint as though it was the unanimous opinion of all right-thinking people. It's fundamentally important. And then endlessly repeating the same message in different variations and combinations. We can see all of that in play in this strategy of caste. And this was also something that I presented as a way of understanding what was being done to us. Next slide, please. Jordan Peterson took that further. And I've called this the colonialist mantra of how divide and rule works. I think it's fundamentally important for every Bharatiya and every Hindu to understand divide and rule in detail so that we can better understand the wounds that we're still trying to heal and better understand how they were inflicted. This is fundamentally important to us becoming an integrated whole. Next slide, please. So in order to do all of this, I produced a report. And the report was presented to the members of the Church of England, the clergy, to the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was presented to peers in the House of Lords and also to the parliamentarians. And it became apparent to them that this was not the simple issue that had been presented to them. But the crux of it was this: that caste as defined in law was a creation of the British colonialists. And I have not had anybody be able to refute the evidence that underlies that assertion. I also established that the Dalits were created by a deliberate legal act of Parliament, the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act, and its implementation directly resulted in hitherto successful, dignified, noble groups of the Bharatiya society being reduced in concentration camps to almost conditions. Dachau and the German concentration camps, the British concentration camps across Africa, all of those were nothing compared to the concentration camps that they wreaked upon members of our community and society there. To try and find a succinct legal language which would contain the essence of our defense, I put forward the proposition that caste legislation denies the Hindu the right to be viewed innocent until proven guilty. It enshrines into law what is clearly and evidence supported a colonialist hate trope, constructed, implemented, deployed, and proliferated by a society and a community, the British colonialists, who are guilty of perpetrating the greatest crimes against humanity I think that the planet has ever seen. Next slide, please. So colonialist trope is one description, but there are assumed truths. And we're facing a situation where the churches have been so busy proliferating this word caste and its meaning that it goes before us. Wherever we go, a person has already heard of caste. And this is in itself is a noteworthy phenomenon. You know, you can go to Charlottesville, Virginia, and go into a hairdresser's and the lady there will have heard of caste. And there is a reason why that's the case. But we have to challenge these assumed truths. And, you know, we've had assumed truths in the past. I've just mentioned that the earth is not flat. And the notion that to be an Indian is not to belong to a caste needs to be asserted. To be an Indian automatically assumes that you're belonging to a caste is a colonialist trope. Now, I put all this information together. Next slide, please. Thank you. Could you return to the main screen? So I've put all of this information together, but my intention was to also achieve a secondary objective. Education is not enough. We're in a battle. We need to not only reach people's minds, but we also need to reach people's hearts. And so any work that we produce has to understand that we need to get the complete emotional engagement of not only Hindus and Hindu children, but also Christians, Christian children, the indigenous community. They need to understand. Now, after Isabel Wilkerson published her ridiculous book, which is an example of confirmation bias combined with prejudices and a complete lack of decent research, once she published a book, it became apparent that we needed to have some sort of counterbalance to it. And so I extended the works that we had enshrined in our reports, produced the book and published it. And that particular book is now doing its work. I'm quite pleased to say that it's being received in many, many places. And it's actually getting to the stage where we have got our local United Kingdom religious education councils even considering the contents of the book. And they are using it to change the manner in which they teach. Up until our exposition, our children going into religious education class in the United Kingdom were being taught, the opening line was, do you understand the caste system? And imagine the trauma that a Hindu child at the age of 10 or 11 suffers when in front of the whole class, their history is being portrayed as being intrinsically discriminating. That child's going to be embarrassed. That child's going to be humiliated. This is a trauma, and it was consciously and deliberately being inflicted upon our children and is still being inflicted upon our children today. But we're challenging that narrative as well. So I would suggest in conclusion, I would really ask everyone to understand that this is not an option for us. This is an existential issue. Please understand that there is a story that is being defended. Our existence and our history is a threat to that story. And what that story is that the dominant forces in the world, their dominance is built on a mountain of human rights abuses. Their claim to supremacy is built on a global crime scene. And our existence and our increasing desire to tell our own truth is a threat to that. There is no way they're going to just back away and say, oh yes, well, sorry, we got it wrong, and now let's carry on. We're going to have to scream them, fighting, screaming and kicking and tooth and nail to bring them to the table, to get them to acknowledge that their right to dominate the discourse in the world is not a right established in justice, and certainly not in equality. So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of those thoughts. And I would like to return back to the moderators. Dr. Sinhaji, thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Sharmaji. That was a very detailed and comprehensive presentation. Please look at the background of Mr. Sharma's screen. The book is highly recommended, Caste Conversion, a Colonial Conspiracy. We need to be equipped with knowledge, and this book is short, brief, but very detailed and very good source of knowledge. I believe somebody has put a link on Amazon. I'll strongly recommend, highly recommend that people do buy and read the book. So I'm going to stop here. I'm just going to make a brief concluding comment, and then we'll move on to two brief presentations by Dr. Sunil Kumar and Geeta ji. I'll make it a little bit lighter. There was a movie I saw, I think it was in 1970s, so most of you will not even understand what I'm talking about. The name of the movie was Diwar. It was an Amitabh Bachchan movie. And the core, or the real starting point of that movie, that somebody had tattooed a statement on his arm. And the statement said in Hindi, Mera baap chor hai, which simply in English means that my father is a thief. This was basically dissemination of his identity that turned him into a very angry young man and eventually becoming a criminal. And the movie had a tragic ending. That was a movie, but in real life, how do you destroy someone's identity or self-esteem? So I will say, consider the following, excuse me, consider the following narratives that are in action right now. First, about India. We talked about that earlier. India is portrayed as a very undesirable, intolerant country. Repeatedly, we hear statements like it's the rape capital of the world, which is absolutely false. US really has that title, tattooed on its forehead for a very long time. It will talk about India has no human rights, oppression of minorities, Kashmir, CEA, you name it, all those things are there. So first, simple narrative that India is not a desirable country, it is a regressive country. Second, they'll attack your culture. Indians are racist. Indians engage in colorism. There's a male patriarchy. We have a privilege, which means your culture does not have anything very desirable. Then the third will be a religion. It's an oppressive, discriminatory caste system in the world. It is the most oppressive system. Dalits are oppressed. Brahmins are the oppressors, and they have a privilege. When I can say from my personal experience, all the Brahmins I knew in India were very poor. Not to mention repeated use of the word like words to malign the religion. So basically, religion does not have any redeeming value either. So you destroyed the country you come from, destroyed your culture, destroyed your religion. So that's pretty much the narrative that is prevalent. Now, you will say, I don't believe of that nonsense. So being raised in India, most of us know that this is nothing but sheer bullshit. But our children who have no exposure to our country or minimal exposure to our culture and to our religion, will see that from a very different lens. And when that is repeatedly told and reinforced in college campuses, they're likely to, quote unquote, somewhat believe it, that maybe we were not given the proper education at home because we did not do that. The effect of this seed of doubt in the mind is going to be devastating in the long run. I know so many examples of parents telling me that they have lost their children after they went to college and that they started disbelieving their own religion and their cultural beliefs. It can spoil family relationships, and a significant amount of effort may be needed to rebuild them back. Bottom line is the following. Don't send your children to school with their minds being a blank slate. Your responsibility does not stop by simply sending them to Bal Vihar. If you don't teach them what and have a personal conversation about all these things, someone else will, and the outcome will not be pretty. I can assure you that. I'm going to end with the following phrase before we go to two statements. Mark Twain once said, "It is very easy to fool a person, but it is extremely difficult to convince him that he has been fooled." When our kids go to college and they get indoctrinated, our job becomes almost impossible to undo that. It takes a good amount of time and maturity on their part, and this is totally unnecessary. So please try to avoid that. Take steps to educate your children before they go to college, have regular conversations so that these things don't become an issue for you, that you have to clean up the mess afterwards. So having said that, I would like to invite a very prominent member of our group, Geeta Sikanji. She would like to say a few words and then followed by Dr. Sunil Kumar. So Geeta ji, please go ahead. You are muted. You may have to unmute yourself, Geeta ji, before you speak.
Thank you, Dr. Praveen Sinha. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. And every speaker this morning has been very, very informative. I want to share that I came to this country 50 years ago, to the United States. I was 19 at the time, And now I am Associate Clinical Professor of Medicine at the University of California, Irvine. And my personal journey began with, I had an arranged interreligious marriage with a clean-shaven Sikh gentleman who is still my husband. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary. While we were raising the children, I have 3 sons who are now grown up. There was a lot of confusion about religion in the family because both our families believed that Hindus and Sikhs are one. And that's the belief we came into with the marriage. But in 1984, when all the Hindu-Sikh problems happened in the political arena, it really affected many such marriages. And so my oldest son was 19 and he was entering college at UC Irvine. And he was very excited when he told me, Mom, I'm going to take a class on world religions and I'm going to learn about both Hinduism and Sikhism and all the rest. And the professor that was teaching him, I remember her first name was Karen. I don't remember her last name. But anyway, when he finished the course, he became so disillusioned with Hinduism, he started hating it. Even if we sat for Havan, he would not like to be sitting in Havan. He was fine with Sikhism. He had no problem with that. And it was very, very painful for me to see that my own son is now anti my religion. And it took like 20 years. I actually got counseling from a Hindu psychiatrist. We went to her and I took my son with me. And she said, you know, that it's okay if he doesn't believe in Hinduism. It's okay, because she didn't want to force him to believe. But eventually, with my own work with him, he's now come around. And he said the other day to me, and he's a physician, by the way, in New Jersey. He said to me, Mom, there is no such thing as Hindutva. It's just made up. Like there's no such thing, you know. So that's been my journey. And I thank you for the opportunity to share.
Yeah, thank you very much, Geeta ji. Just want to remind everyone that not all professors come in the shape of Audrey Trusky that you can immediately identify them. A lot of them will be very nice, but you do not know what they teach and how your religion is being presented. So keep your eyes open on that. With that, Geeta ji, thank you very much.
One last thing I wanted to say, that the whole journey that he got, you know, disillusioned from Hinduism was related to casteism, because she really taught that.
Thank you, Geeta ji. And I would say Sharma ji's book is a very helpful resource for somebody who wants to understand the casteism better. I'll just say one thing about casteism. I went to one clubhouse room, which was basically, you know, annihilating Hinduism. And I asked the following question. I am now for quite some time asking questions to all my family members. And to this date, I do not know what my caste is. I belong to a caste community, which has got very prominent people in Indian politics and otherwise. Amitabh Bachchan is a caste. Dr. Rajendra Prasad was a caste. Subhash Chandra Bose was a caste. I'm a caste, and I can name 20 other people. But none of them can be identified as Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. Cannot be. Amitabh Bachchan's father in his biography wrote that he is a Dalit. Sorry, Shudra, not Dalit. He's a Shudra category. So the fluidity of caste system is very difficult for most people to understand who want to pigeonhole us. So just remember that part. Never take this lightly when somebody tries to pigeonhole you. Educate yourself and educate them. So thank you very much. I would like to have Dr. Sunil Kumar come in and say a few words. Thank you, Sunil ji.
Everybody, and Praveen ji, thank you for organizing this wonderful 2-hour-long session. It's so, you know, educational and motivating also, eye-opening at the same time. So I will share one experience as a parent and then another as a professor, I see from both sides. So when my older son was in high school, you know, he was very active in Shakha and he was a Mukh Shikshak at that time. That is, he was running San Diego Shakha. And one day he tells me, Papa, what is about Sikhs? And he came to this country at the age of 4. I say, what happened? He said, my teacher says, you know, my teacher was giving example of the discrimination and he was saying how Hindus torture Sikhs. And, you know, he had learned good thing about Hindus. So I said, you know, at that time, Dr. Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister of India. I said, Sikhs are less than 2%. And Indian Prime Minister is a Sikh. Indian Army Chief is a Sikh. You know, in America, can you imagine a 2% minority can have both? Go and talk to your teacher. So he went and talked to the teacher, and teacher told, I have a Sikh friend who had told me this, and that's why I narrated it in the class. But then my son said, but why do you give this example when students don't even know what is a Sikh? There are only 5 Hindu students. Why don't you give example of an African American, how whites do with the blacks? Why do you give example of Hindu and Sikh? So that's the kind of bias, you know, is there among the teachers. And it is not innocent. I know that part as a professor. Just quickly, I mean, I and Praveerji were involved in this CSU, you know, when students took this, resolution. And I talked to 3 students who were the authors of that resolution. I had a 1-hour call with them just before they voted. And they said, this is about human rights. I say, this is about human rights. And one of the students was a Sikh. And he said, you know, we have a Ravdasiya Sikhs. I said, yes. But why do you give example of Hindu categories here? You know, if you are talking about human rights and you say the Sikhs have it and others also have caste, which we know is a fact, then why only give example of Hindu categories? And he didn't have any answer to that. And then I attended a UCST. In UCST, there was a seminar on 370 and how the genocide is happening in Kashmir. And the professor was from Berkeley. And I introduced myself as a professor there, but they said, no, you cannot interject. You cannot ask any question. Questions will be only written questions. And it was a South Asian department, you know, seminar. And teacher, you know, the speaker from Berkeley, lecturer, said something, and I could not keep quiet. And they say, you get out. I said, I'm a professor. I'm sorry, you know, but let me stay. They say, you know, next time you say something, we'll call police and get you arrested. And they did send me police after me. When I was walking to the parking lot with my wife and a friend, they said a police car behind me to chase me. That is the kind of viciousness these people have. You know, they will take their ideology to any extent and humiliate another professor at a major university in the same town, you know. And I'm a doctoral faculty at UCST myself, but doesn't matter. And there was another medical college professor from UCST present in that talk, and they didn't treat him well either. So it doesn't matter to them. It's my way or highway. They are so much vicious about or against us, and there are so much groomed in their ideology. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sunilji, very much for sharing your experience. Before we move to Q&A, I just want to take a few minutes to acknowledge a few people here who have made all this possible. And Neeraj Kashalkar, who has been partner in my crime from day one, since IAIOC was formed. Without him, nothing happens here. And as usual, he's the one who's doing everything. So Neeraj, thank you very much. In addition, we got 2 new friends added to the group, Harshad and Manjri. They have roots in Clubhouse, which is an amazing place to find very amazing people, and they both are example of that. So thank you, Manjri, and thank you, Harshad, for being part of this and helping us out. Finally, I want to thank Mr. Vibhuti Jha, who is here also. Vibhuti Ji, are you here? He was very helpful to me in putting this expert panel together. I want to remind everyone that Vibhuti Ji is a host of Jaipur Dialogues USA, which is a YouTube channel. And he's also a regular on Jaipur Dialogue show with Sanjay Dikshit. And I believe he also has a show on ITV, which I was part of it some time back. So thank you, Vibhuti Ji, very much for all your help. And I hate to say it again, he's one of my Clubhouse friends. So I'm not trying to do a Clubhouse club, but I have really met some amazing people, including Satish Sharma Ji as well. So thank you, Vibhuti Ji, for your help. If you want to say a few things, you may please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. You know, this is something which I wanted to say, that just remember the year 1991, April. That is the year when I came to this country. So I do not know what you were doing at that time, but just close your eyes and just figure out where you were. So give me 2 minutes. My job at that time was to market India's liberalization program and cross-border business between India and the US. Believe me, it is very, very gratifying to hear the, eloquent speakers come up and speak so much about the thoughts and processes and the struggles and the realities and everything that you have dealt with. I was dealing with all of this all alone by myself, starting from 1991 onwards. So I have answered questions about India, Hinduism, which have ranged from sublime to stupid. But cutting across all the things, what I want to request all of you is that take nothing for granted. Those who want to destroy us are remarkably organized and remarkably active. And I have seen this happen ever since 1991. So what I want to say is that I recall, we were talking about children and everything else. I dealt with all these issues. So I would say only two things, internally and externally. Internally, think about 1941 census. Have a look at that in Google. And that's the time we realized, it shocked me, that there were just about 145,000 British in this country, plus women and children, who ruled us millions. So despite all our Vedic wisdom, knowledge, information, why did we let that happen? Why didn't we use our knowledge to prevent and stop that thing to happen to us? The second part which I wanted to say to you, this is what I was told by a management guru. A Harvard guy gave a talk in Bankers Club in Bangalore in 1983. Shit, I looks like I'm a prehistoric man here. 1983 Bankers Club in Bangalore. He said the Indians do not need to go to Ivy League colleges to learn management. What they need to do is to study Mahabharata, Gita, and Ramayana. All life lessons are right out there. So the question that challenges most of us here, Gita ji was very eloquently talking about her challenge about Hinduism and Sikhism and how her son got affected by that, is that unless and until we read our own texts, we will never understand the rules of the game. So the important part here is, if we do not know, most of the Indians, as somebody had earlier mentioned, we were in India, we took our knowledge for granted, landed here, we were busy making our life a successful life. We actually, I call them India-born confused desis. So we became India-born confused desis, least connect with India. Chalta hai, we were earning here, we came to make our life good, and we made it. And then we produced America-born confused desis. And because we were not connected at the spiritual and textual level of our own faith, they all ended up becoming Hindus in name only. You see the correlation of the three elements. So to destroy that part of it, we have to go back to our roots. And that's very important. I have drawn my roots from Ramayana, that I drew a Lakshman Rekha. In my personal behavior, family relationships, or collegial contact, professional contacts, I have drawn a Lakshman Rekha this far and no further. So when I was here way back in 91, an American CEO asked me, "Oh, are you from Pakistan?" And my immediate response was, "No, I'm an Indian, we are the good guys." So the question here is that how you want to respond to those people. You have to tell them who they are. So whether it's cow, beef eating, the way we are, we have to know. Then only we can explain. If we don't know, then we get attacked. And all of you here, I'm delighted to see the eloquent bunch of people. Dr. Sinha has been on my show. Thank you for doing a great one here today. Pandit Sharma ji and I have shared platform on Jaipur Dialogue, and we talked about on my show. Arnav has come, Mr. Kejriwal has come on my show too. So thank you very much, all of you, for being here. And yes, we are Clubhouse friends. And technology, we Hindus have one last thing. We Hindus have a unique opportunity to take advantage of the tectonic shift brought about by technology. This is happening because of technology. We must make that technology leap work for us. If not, we will be doomed forever. More on that later. Thank you very much, Shanadi, for hosting.
Thank you very much, Vibhuti-ji, for those words and words of wisdom. I think we should all think about it. I'll just say one last thing, then we'll move on to Q&A. My wife has registered for courses at Hindu University of America, and she's taking more courses now. It's about time that those of us who have been Indian-born confused desis become more knowledgeable desis. So thank you for those lines. I like them. So please go ahead. I think, Harshad, you are the one who will be presenting the questions. So please go ahead with Q&A. Thank you all for waiting for so long. We talked too much.
Dr. Sinha, can I just for just 1 second here? Anybody who wants to ask a question or say something, please send the question in the chat and Harshad will coordinate it. And if you could also enable your cameras, we would love to bring you up for your specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Manjari. Thank you. And once your question has been asked, if you want to, if you have a follow-up question, then that will be done as well. So first question, it's a combination of 2 questions. One was asked by Geeta Sikanji, and the second one was asked by Raj, where Geeta ji asks that how do we deal with our Hindu friends who are not willing to recognize Hindu phobia? Can they be convinced to change their views? And the second one is, how should Hindu American students, especially students who are second generation Americans with limited direct experience in Indian society, how should they deal with classmates or activists who are spreading Hindu phobia? So I would ask Dr. Satish Sharma, Pandit Satish Sharma, to take these questions. Thank you.
Wonderful questions. The first question, this is not an easy ask. Educating somebody, unless they have a vested interest, is a tough thing to do. In our tradition, we have always valued the conversation that a person has with their inner conscience as being sacred and sacrosanct. This is why we don't convert. We don't intrude into somebody else's thought processes. And so it's quite a challenge for us to suddenly become capable of doing that work. And whenever we try to do it, generally we fail. I would suggest that one other thing that I've learned is that it's very difficult to do these sorts of things face to face, because when you're requiring a person to challenge their own worldview, it's hard to do in front of somebody. Most people cannot suddenly sit back and say, oh yes, everything I believe was completely nonsense, and you're right, and I admit that openly in front of you. So it has to be done with a greater degree of skill. The way in which I chose to do this with regard to this particular issue, and it's a principle I'm going to talk about, is that there are people who I know who are died in the war Christians, shall we say, and there was no amount of conversion expertise that I could wield to make them change their point of view. But when they read the book that I'd published, they came back, and many of them had the good grace to say, we never knew this. And so it's something that has to be done offline. It's something that has to be done skillfully so that a person can receive the information in a format and a space which is not requiring them to confront their own lack, either in a public space or in front of anybody else. So the utility of producing videos, the utility of holding conferences like this and sessions like this, and then recording the material and sharing it with others is a huge leap forward. It's such a vital thing, which is a significant part of why Vibhuti has undertaken JD US, why I do so many YouTube videos, etc. It's a means whereby we can teach people. A number of people have mentioned Clubhouse, and so I'm just going to refer to it. Clubhouse is an amazing development. It's a mechanism whereby people can engage in conversations, put their concerns in front of other complete strangers without having to disclose their identity. And this is such an important development. We have now had so many robust exchanges where we've been able to put forward very potentially controversial perspectives and have people consider them and challenge them and then defend them. It's almost like a technical, an IT development of the philosophy and principle of Upanishad, which means to sit close by. So more and more opportunities to sit close by allows us to leverage skillful communication. In conclusion, I would say that it's actually an enjoyable task. It's a dance that you engage in with another person. And when you become skillful at it, there is an element of shared anand, that when both people dance with a degree of levity, a bit of a smile at our own foolishness, a non-threatening engagement, suddenly the opportunity arises for an understanding to appear. And so we need to develop those skills. We need to take as much delight in the dance as we do in the content of what we share. And if we can do that in a very short space of time, we can help undo the harm which has been inflicted over a huge period of time. We're challenging, in the caste issue, we're challenging a philosophy and a propaganda exercise in which they have invested 200 years. It has been proliferated from every pulpit. It has been published and interjected into every conversation that a Hindu has with other Hindus and indeed with their own identity. This is not a small thing to do, but we can do it with skillful communication. But I would say, let's get to the stage where we can do it with a bit of anand and everybody enjoys the process. We emerge as winners both in the dance. That's my response to those questions. Thank you. They're really good questions. I'm glad we had an opportunity to explore them.
I will just add one thing to it, is that there are some things you can counter with facts. And if the facts are on your side, you can make a case much better. And I'll try to bring out issue of, say, caste-based discrimination in India or in the US. That narrative is being propagated, who knows, literally everywhere you go. And Equality Labs did a very good job in, data mining and putting together something that was totally a bunch of lies. It is our responsibility now to spread the results of two very important surveys done by Americans, which basically show that that is all absolutely not true. And we are working on that, and I think we'll keep on working, but sometimes some things are easier to counter, some things are more difficult. So these you talk about things which are very difficult. I'm just talking about a very tiny sliver of things which are sort of easier to do. So before they can accuse you of more and more things, some things can be countered. So we are working on that, and we'll have a white paper that will circulate to everyone on how to undo the narrative that has been propagated about caste discrimination in US and in India from latest data. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha. The next question has been asked by Vashisht, where he says, how can we pool our resources and act together against Hinduphobia instead of acting in silos? And how can we organize our scholars and academics and influencers to work together when an issue arises, rather than working in their own individual bubbles? And he also says, how can we leverage our organizations and come up with a think tank to fight the academic cabal?
May I request to ask this question myself, because there's a sequel to it as well.
Sure, Bhanu.
Go ahead, Bhanu.
I'm into analysis of audience and the narrative, not in a very scholarly way. But if a 17-year-old has to go to college, do we have a right set of influencers here who talk the language that a 17-year-old wants to or is accustomed to hear? Because most of the times we will see in our households, and that example goes pretty well for me and my dad, the person I would last hear to on the planet would be my dad. So I am very sure that the parents of those kids who are going to enter university, they would be in the least position to give them any piece of advice. This is my first part. Second part is, when we are targeted by blacks or whites or people like Audrey Trushke and these professors who are left-wing, why are we not seeking help of these ISKCON devotees who have taken so happily into the fold of Hindutva? They're right next door. I mean, can't we have them as a brand ambassador to talk, because our kids would probably listen to them because they are more mainstreamed. And the third thing is, till how long Hindu kids or kids of Indian origin will keep looking at their scorecard instead of going into mainstream activities like be a part of some pop band, do something which is mainstream American growing up, pop culture, sports, BMS, bicycling, adventure, or we will retain ourselves into these scholarly conversations. Don't get me wrong, but are we feeling the pulse of the kids who are going to enter university? Thank you.
Bhanu, who would you like to take your question?
Anyone who wants to think about it and organize a think tank, because yeah, anyone.
I can answer part of this. And so, for example, so when we talk about audience, I'll address that first. And one of the things that you may have noticed if anyone attended the CAST hearings in Santa Clara County is that a lot of the responses that the Indian nationals or people who are naturalized citizens, people from India, gave were predictable to the opponents, because they would say things such as, oh, well, I don't know my caste, or, we don't tell our kids about it. The British invented it. These are all things that might be true, but they are also predictable, because the way, and as I kind of mentioned in sort of the academic theories behind it, is when you say, I don't see race as a white person, that is taken as evidence that you're privileged. So when you say, I don't see caste, they're going to say, well, see, there you go. You are a Savarna, you are an upper caste. And so, you clearly have this privilege. So I think one of the things with the audience is, spend some time. So, so personally for me, I don't advocate like, do not take these classes, do not read these books. In fact, a lot of times you should read them, because you need to understand where they're coming from so that you can predict, what they will say, how they will frame an argument, and then make sure that what you say resonates with them, because that's one thing that Equality Labs did really well, is they wrote their report, and they presented it and connected with people who were predisposed, to, sympathize with the arguments that they made. And that is how it was able to get a lot of traction among the Western press. Now, when we talk about, say, talking to the kids or talking to the second generation kids, I think this is also really important, because there is obviously a disconnect. I mean, I have that, certainly at 17 years old, I had that with my parents. And I think that we have to learn how to talk to each other in families about issues that may be uncomfortable, and also give like really kind of substantive answers, not dismissive answers. So if your child asks you, oh, XYZ problem in India, what is that? And if you give a dismissive answer, that might be interpreted based on the education that they receive as, oh, you're denying it, or you don't know. And that's actually not the case. It's like a lot of these cases, and as I've had more exposure to people from India directly, I've realized that these are a lot of times questions that are very difficult, even in an purely Indian context, for Indians themselves to discuss, and let alone discuss it with their child who is predisposed to be rebellious and in a different culture. So it's going to take a lot of work. And I think that, having looked at the past, when we've been involved in these caste issues, or any types of these anti-India, activists that are out there, that's one of the disconnects I've been seeing, is where the arguments that, say, the second generation American kids might make might be framed in the same way as, say, the social justice activists. And they're doing that because that is also the cultural environment they're growing up in. They're using words, and they're using media, social media platforms to spread their message among each other. So I think the good news is that I think you can actually have a lot of trust and faith in your kids, because when you look at TikTok, you look at, say, the Hindus on campus, you see that these are kids who have internalized the values that they were raised with, while at the same time adopting, strategies and tactics that are, effective in an American context. So I think there's some good news there. Now, regarding, the sort of non-Indian origin Hindus, white, Black, I mean, I do see some of that out there. One of the things that I, have struggled with a little bit on this issue is, for example, there are a lot of white yoga practitioners or meditation, or maybe various different Indic traditions. But since a lot of times, culturally, they might still be in a left or a liberal progressive type of camp, what ends up happening is they also are targeted, by these same activists to disavow associations with Hindutva. If you look at, say, the American Democratic Party, and especially, say, a lot of the progressive wing, a lot of Bernie Sanders, for example, mentions Hindu nationalism, mentions Kashmir. So you have to look at, where are they in their own, because they're not part of the Indian society. They're not necessarily subject to those pressures. They're subject to other pressures and part of other communities. And in those cases, sometimes those might clash. And so I think, there is definitely a space for them. And I think we do need to show that, there is a universality to Hinduism that transcends, our ethnic or, national origin boundaries. That's definitely important. But at the same time, I would just, it's a two-way street. You have to understand where they're coming from in their context and figure out a way for them to feasibly advocate, with you in that regard.
I have one simple thing, because you went around elaborating, and I'm sorry if I'm taking everybody's time, because this is so close to my heart, and I'm trying to work with youth in US, UK. In my small ways, I would like to connect to more student bodies and make them think contemporary. I mean, because also here, if I talk about, content for youth, I always tell that YouTubers cannot be somebody who's 40 years and they want to talk about, because the generation and the formation age is either 8 to 13 or 13 to 17. After 17, your kid is practically lost, and you have to do maybe 5x the effort to bring him back to your fold. So I'd like to speak to the person who was just speaking right before. But my simple example is, why doesn't a Pakistani get to be questioned on the same lines? If it was the same thing, what is it that Pakistan or Pakistani origin kids are doing different than Indians or Indian origin kids and parents? We need to benchmark. That's all. Thank you so much.
So that's also an interesting point. And, so I came of age, I was in college on 9/11. And so I remember actually at that time, my parents called me up and they were afraid that I would be mistaken as Muslim, right? And, deal with some blowback. And, it's very interesting, looking at sort of the state of Islam in America, where, there was obviously a lot of, opinions negative about it in the United States right afterwards. But I think very gradually, they also, were able to sort of integrate into a progressive democratic fold. And so I think it's a long-term effort. I mean, I'm talking 20 years. And one of the things that they did was, they have institutions. They have institutions that go out there that interact with communities. And also, if you remember, when you're positioned as a marginalized community, whether as if you're saying you're an Indian Muslim, you're marginalized. If you are in a Western Muslim, you're marginalized. That kind of creates, just theoretically, when people, conceptualize, society, that they're going to say, well, you know what, regardless of whatever I personally feel about it, this is a marginalized group of people. And so I need to advocate for them. And so, if you think about in the US, we have a model minority, a lot of times we're called white adjacent. So the fact that, yes, our success in the United States, relatively speaking, is in fact, in this case, a barrier, because we're not as sympathetic victims. We're a bunch of people who live in work in tech and have all of these jobs and have nice houses or whatever. And so why care about us? Because we're not marginalized. And so I think educating people that our status right now is something that we fought for, we worked very hard for, but is not guaranteed. It is not guaranteed in this country or any other country. And you just have to look at the diaspora throughout the world to see that that is the case. Uganda, South Africa, Fiji, all of these places. And I think when people realize that and realize that you can be marginalized and that you are marginalized, and communicating our pain and communicating our history, I think we can build up that groundwork, but it's not going to be something you do within the next 6 months.
I'll just add one thing to it. What Raj mentioned, you need to understand how they think or the kind of questions they might have. What I will share with you is a document that I mentioned, because when they go to college, they will be asked to think in a certain way. They will be made certain arguments. And I think if you can have a counter argument to what their argument is, you may have a better chance of, at least equipping them with how to argue about those things. So I will definitely share that document with you, which sort of, helps them convince that you are racist, colorist, you name it, and we can provide counter arguments which are convincing. And so Hagji talked about that. So we can give you some more information. In the end, I would say the level of communication between you and your child is a very different can of worms, but it's a very important one. If they can't even listen to you, then you have to solve a very different problem first. So these are all correlated factors that we have to take into consideration, and they make the job a little bit more harder. So Harshad, do we have another question?
Could I chime in on that one for a moment?
Please go ahead.
There is another dimension to this. Banuji, you asserted and put forward the notion that it's very difficult to communicate with 17-year-olds, and I understand exactly where you're coming from. But there is I think there's a factor, a variable that we're not considering, right? And this needs to be considered. Dr. Swami, whatever you think of him, I've just checked, he has 10.3 million followers. And the vast majority of them are between the age of about 18 and probably about 40. I think the peak of the bell curve is probably between about 18 and 25, 28, that sort of figure. And the reason he has such a following, despite everybody's opinion about his erratic swings and everything else, he's actually a charming person, right? He is courageous. He puts his neck on the line. He gives as good as he gets in his own words, and he's quite entertaining to engage with, right? And no matter how just our cause, no matter how valid our arguments and our understanding, if we're boring, children and young people are just not going to engage. And I'm going to use an extreme example, and that is that this whole notion of radicalization of our young daughters, and not just our young daughters, but young daughters by particular ideology, it doesn't happen because they present them with facts, right? It doesn't happen because they give them a wonderful analysis of history or anything like that. It happens because they charm them. It happens because they know how to touch their hearts. They know how to pull those strings, right? And we have to understand that in order to engage with people, we have to be able to connect on an emotional level. And this is somewhere where we have not been strong enough. This I would recommend to everybody to consider. It's no longer enough to be cerebrally powerful, but emotionally crippled. And this is a skill that we have to acquire. I just wanted to point that out. So this is an important thing. If we're going to connect with kids, we can't be boring old farts, if you'll excuse the expression. Now, you see, that's the sort of expression that youngsters would appreciate, but how few of us would actually use that sort of an expression. So I would submit that as worthy of consideration.
So a follow-up question on that would be, what sort of resources would you recommend for teaching Hinduism to our kids and teenagers? To Pandit Sharma.
I think my book, you can't beat my book, right? It's mischievous, it's aggressive, it's assertive, it's challenging. Whoever you give it to, right? I guarantee you they will smile at least half a dozen times. They'll squirm a few times and say, did he really write that? Did he really accuse them of this? But that's the sort of teaching and that's the sort of engagement and connecting we need. I wouldn't teach them history, right? I would teach them using plays. I would teach them using some of the incredible stories that are enshrined in our kathas. Children became Hindus because they loved doing Ram Navami celebrations. They loved dressing up whilst they were really, really young. Those things touch us at a very deep level. On top of that, I would teach them teach them the courageous history of our recent past. But I wouldn't go into details of our academic achievements and our mathematicians and the Vedic mathematics we attained, and we created the zero. All those sorts of things come at a later stage. We have to connect with their hearts at an early age, make them passionate, make them tearful, make them resonate with who we are, and the rest will follow automatically.
Okay, it has been about 2 hours and 2.5 hours. Do we want to take just one last question, Harsha, then be done? Because I think people have been very patient. Yeah, okay.
Sure.
So go ahead.
So I wanted this to be answered either by Arnav or Rashmi, but they have, I think they have left. So I'll ask it to anyone on the panel who can answer it. So it's a twofold question. First is, how do we do an outreach to Hindu students on campus who might not have had a very Dharmic or Indian upbringing, and they're confused about their identity? Can they be persuaded to reassert their Hindu identity through student organizations in universities? So an example of this would be Jewish organizations who actively reach out to the Jewish student population in universities. And the second part of the question is, if a student is being bullied or persecuted due to their Hindu identity, what can they do? Who should they reach out to? And what escalation ladder should they follow? Thank you.
I think Arnav, I can go through your second question. Arnav talked about that, and Sunilji can add to that as well, is that there are procedures for reporting harassment or discrimination on campus. Every university has a dean of students or somebody along that title. But as Arnav reported, sometimes it may not even register with them. And as he said, that they even block the account. So that is certainly the right way to go in terms of finding what your recourse on campus is. And Rutgers may be an extreme example, but most of the universities take these things very seriously. They don't let the students be harassed and bullied on campus and not take any action. If a formal request is made, the dean of students will definitely take. So demonizing all the universities will not be the right thing to do. And there are formal procedures available within the universities to take action. A lot of them may be suppressed under freedom of speech, but targeting any individual particularly will definitely be taken as a serious matter, and universities do take it seriously. What was the first question? Maybe somebody else can answer it.
Yeah, maybe Raj, if you can take that one, where you have people who have drifted away from the dharmic fold, and how, like, do you know any cases where people have been successfully made to come back?
No, I mean, I would say I'm one of those people in certain ways, and I would say that there's a couple of things. One is that in my particular case, I was exposed to different places, and so was constantly sort of asked, and I realized that regardless of how I outwardly act or what my personal practice or my personal lifestyle is, that I am still treated and perceived and grouped, and so you're part of this community, you're born into it. It is something where I don't want to, the realization for me kind of came where I said, regardless of whatever I do or however I believe, and whether that is the same, whether that is quote orthodox, whether that is the same as how my parents or grandparents or other people in my community practice, that I don't want to ever get in a situation at school, at work, where I have to actively disavow my heritage and my values and my beliefs, where I actively have to work against them. Because I think when you realize it in that way, when you realize that, at some point, no matter how, much you act as if, you're trying to, fit in, that you are still who you are. And I think sometimes that is a really personal journey. It takes a while, and I think I have a lot of faith that most people realize that, once they're pushed that far. The other thing I would say is, and I think this also goes into some of the earlier questions about the youth, is also realizing the diversity of our heritage and traditions, that, there are paths and expressions of Hindu Dharma that are not necessarily what you were raised with, because, we were all raised with probably very, very different variations of, our own traditions. And so I think when you get to a point where you realize you can make it your own, and I think especially maybe as an American kid, it's like, very individualistic. So it's like, once, I got to a point where I realized like, no, this is something, yes, I have my parents, I have my family, and this is my family heritage, but this is also something that is mine. And this is something that I can move forward with in my way that I, in the way that, I want to go. And I think so that ownership, and then realizing that, when you are like, when I was in, working in Chinese environments and I'm asked about these things, I kind of realized, because, there is sort of an opinion, for example, that say China has towards India. It's a mix. I mean, it's half positive, or the land of Buddhism, but it's also like, oh, you're much poorer and darker than us, right? I mean, there is kind of that undercurrent. And when I realized, like, what, I am not going to do myself any favors, and I'm not doing my Indian coworkers any favors by, trashing my own heritage, because people don't actually respect people who do that. And I think, when it takes a while to realize that, I think, like I said, when I was in college 20 years ago, like, I didn't have to face this same degree of specific Hindu phobia, but I think I've been challenged on it enough. And then when I do that, you realize who you are, what your own values are, and then you move forward with it.
Thank you very much, Raj. I think that was the last question. So I want to thank Pandit Satish Sharma ji for coming and giving us a beautiful lecture and helping us
understand. May I make a
understand
closing remark?
Yeah, you may just give me a second. And I also want to thank Sunil Kumar ji for coming. He has been my partner in crime recently and a good friend that I've made in dealing with this problem. And I see, I think that's the people I see here right now. Other people have left now, so I'll stop at that. Satish ji, please go ahead, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ji. I've just had a couple of thoughts which arose as a result of the previous question and the answers that were given, in terms of how do we inspire our youngsters to become proud of their identity and their heritage. And it struck me that one thing that we have really not had enough of is tangible, visible nobility. We need individuals who stand in our community and our children look at them and say, actually, that person embodies the principles of the greatest civilization on earth. They need to be able to look up and say, wow, that person did this, that person said this, etc., etc. And so we need to find a way of doing that. The last one I think we had who was on that scale was either Vivekanandaji or Sri Aurobindoji, but they are now sort of figments of our history as opposed to tangible present influences. So we need to inculcate nobility. And I would suggest that there's nothing like victory to inculcate a desire to be attached to it. And we have just only yesterday had the news that Rashmiji, her situation, it's been acknowledged, but it's only the beginning. But just the ripple effect of being able to say that we have had this happen at Oxford University, the same place that cancelled my event for Dr. Subramanian Swamy to speak there, that cancelled my event for Rajiv Malhotraji to speak there, that have cancelled so many of our events. They have finally been able to, we've got to the stage where they've acknowledged that they were wrong. This is a massive achievement. We're going to try and ensure that Rashmiji, her achievement, it's circulated, people are aware of it, and that people can take delight in this achievement as part of this achievement. It was a wonderful thing that we've done. And that is what we need to do more of. And there are so many opportunities. I'm thinking now of I'm toying with the idea of having some sort of an event to reclaim the Fibonacci series. Okay, Fibonacci in his own words said that he copied this from Indian mathematicians. Guys, why aren't we having the mischievous event to do Gharvapasi on Fibonacci? Right, now that sounds to me, you see, you're all smiling. Everyone is smiling, right? But that would be wonderful, wouldn't it? And that would be the sort of thing, if we can get our youngsters to get engaged in those, we achieve both objectives. They will have the delight of establishing a connection with a noble heritage, an educated, wise heritage, but also the delight of victory. And that is something that we need to look to do. I would do more and more things like that. So let's try and give them examples of nobility. And I think half of the work will be done. That was my closing remarks. Thank you for the opportunity to just close with those, Dr. Sinhadi.
Yeah, thank you, Sadhiji. That was really inspiring. And I agree with you. We need to do something on Fibonacci series and other things that we should reclaim. And as we talked about earlier, we have to do some more mischief together. So that will be one of them. So thank you. I saw Radhika on the screen. She's not. Oh, Radhika, hi. Would you like to say something? Radhika, she's an old friend of mine. She's a professor at UCI and very much interested in these topics, having small children, college age. So Radhika, please go ahead. What do you want?
Wonderful one, Praveen. Great one. Phenomenal job by you and other organizers, and enjoyed listening to all the speakers. Thank you for doing this. Well, I have two young kids, as Praveen mentioned. My older one is 11, and we talk about this stuff regularly at home. And a big goal is that, yes, catch them while they're still young. Their minds are virgin territory. And as a mother, if I can't influence them, I see that as a personal failure. So yes, I mean, hopefully they will be prepared once they are in college to face issues like this. I mean, going back to my personal experience, caste was never a lived experience. If you will, yes, I come from an OBC, grew up in a big city in India, I've had way more conversations about caste after I came to the US. I recall my first semester here in the US, there was this South Korean student would happily copy off of my statistics homework. And then one fine day he turns around and tells me about caste system and how bad that is. And I'm completely on defensive there. I mean, I don't know how to talk about it. But hopefully my kids are better prepared, because between then and now, in the 2 decades between then and now, I've had a chance to read more of this stuff. I'm aware of Satish Sharmaji's books. It's on my list of books to read. It's on my Kindle. So yes, and I've had the opportunity to converse about all of these things with my kids, especially with my older one. So thank you, Praveen. Thank you for doing this.
If I could say one thing in closing, just a really quick remark.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that also, on reflection, really kept me in the fold is my parents. Their living example. It's not necessarily what they indoctrinated me or taught me, but it is their own personal conduct, their values, and their behavior, how they approach family, how they approach their community, and how they conduct themselves, because they are Hindus and they behave as Hindus, as devout Hindus, and that is a good example. And when you're in college and when you meet other people, you will see for yourself that it is something worth retaining.
I'd like to second what, sorry.
Just one point I have to add. I'm sorry, I was waiting for Raj to finish. I believe in some small hacks. If you have to make your kids
Banuji,
learn about,
if you're going to contribute, I want to hear you contribute with a smile on your face. I know it's late where you are, but take some joy in working these things out. Okay. All right.
surely, Panditji, just two very quick hacks. Can we just make a small template for our kids to know by heart? If we use curiosity as a mechanism, if somebody is questioning you, if we make them curious, they will suddenly become on defensive. So there are thousands of things about India. If we can just have some 10 things, like, do you know where is the oldest city in the world? And when they will say no, we don't know. And you can tell them that it's like 70 kilometers west of the Gujarat coast. It's 28,000-year-old city. And then we can have so just a small template of 10 to 15 points. If it talks about caste, let's give them that who were our greatest teachers and they wrote certain compilations. See, all these work as toolkits. Toolkits is a beautiful word. Let's develop toolkits, let's develop hacks. And even if you have to teach your own kids, you have to use this curiosity element. Three things only work with youth: curiosity, music, and wit. There is no fourth thing that you can infuse knowledge in a child which is not willing to listen to you. But if you use these three things, they will start putting their ears to you. That's it. Thank you. I'm done. I think I took too long.
No, that's fine. You made valid points, and I think people are working on these things. You can see a lot of YouTube videos geared by people who have the right intentions. Maybe we need to compile them together, create a resource where everybody can go. Satishji pointed out videos by Subramanian Swami, and I can tell you a lot of other people who are doing really good work, and maybe we need to put them together. I just want to say one thing about Raj's comment, and I think Sunilji had a question too. There are a couple of things we should keep in mind about our children. First and foremost, they will eventually become like you. It takes time. They all want to be like their fathers and mothers. That's a very, very universal phenomenon, unless you've done something horribly wrong. But that is not the way the Indian ways are. And secondly, nobody wants to hate their identity or their religion. They are forced, or they are sort of put into that position by external forces, which are sometimes, unfortunately, more powerful than you are. So exert your power, educate your children. Like Radhika said, I think it starts very early in life. If you do the right things, your children will not be swayed by these people who come with half knowledge and know nothing except want to perpetuate hate against one religion, or try to apply one ridiculous theory in your context when it does not even has any bearing to be applied in that context. So keep a couple of those things in mind. In the end, they'll be fine. I just want to minimize the pain people will go through before they leave and come back, like the way Geeta ji was talking about. And she went through a lot of pain, and I appreciate her openly sharing those thoughts, because a lot of people, I know so many parents here who do in Orange County who have told me personally, but don't want to share that publicly, because it's a painful process to go through that, because children don't believe in your values, and they're basically, you have only two choices: either to succumb to what they believe or sever relationships. So those are very tough decisions, and I think nobody should be put into that position. And I think that's part of the purpose of what we're doing. So Sunilji, you want to say the last word?
I don't know if I'm qualified to say last word, but on the issue of how to reach out to children and others, first thing I want to second what Praveenji said. My older son, as I said, he was a Shakha Mukh Shikshak, then he went to Berkeley. And he never said, I'm not a Hindu. He said, I'm agnostic. I'm not sure. But now he's 28 and he's coming around. We have to be patient. If we try to force it, then they only go away much, more and more. So whenever he asked question earlier, I would react. There was, remember the Nirbhaya rape, and we were discussing here, and I, was a little sarcastic. And he said, Papa, it's very difficult to talk to you. I'm not talking about this issue. And I realized I have lost that conversation. But with time, we also grow with children, and they do come around. Other day, he was talking to, he has a company, and he was talking to a potential partner. And he said, he right now he's staying with us because of COVID. He said, my parents did not raise me, in a way that I will cheat you. I've been raised with the integrity. So you can expect integrity from me. And he was talking in his room. I was downstairs listening from the, just listening by chance from the living room. And I was so proud. That's, they observe the parents. And slowly that cultural, that pride also comes back. It takes time, but not without some work from parents. We have to be patient and work. Second is, I and Praveenji were in a discussion with the California State University Faculty Association's president, who is a professor in STSU, and he's a Black professor. And there were three of us who were in the call, so Praveenji will recall it. And I told him how decentralized and multifaceted and plural Hindu traditions are. Because, the Western audience thinks just like Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, it's one book, one God, and one philosophy. We have to tell them, we assume that they know it. We have to tell them, no, there is no one book, there is no one God, there is no one philosophy. It's a meta, it's an ensemble of traditions. And Praveenji will remember it. He said, Sunilji, so Professor Sunil, you taught me something new today. So we have to remember where our children also come from, because they are growing up in this environment and they think things in a very homogeneous fashion. Either it is wrong or right? Either you are a believer or you are a sinner, that kind of situation. That's not what we are, and we have to emphasize it again and again. Another point is there was a temple hearing here, and the board, there was some Christian neighbors, and the board, they told the board that, oh, there'll be a lot of traffic, just like in a church. And our temple, people, I had just gone there out of curiosity. They said, this will pass, don't worry. I said, no, it may not pass. So we took some of the STSU students, but I had written my name as a speaker, and I said, look, you are all used to Christian congregations where you meet on a certain, day on Sunday at a time, and there's a lot of traffic. Hindus are not like that. We go to the temple all the time. It's open a lot of times. And the commissioner told me, Professor, thank you so much. You taught us something new today. And that resolution, their proposal passed because they said there's no traffic issue. Again, why I'm saying is that we fail to recognize that these people here, their worldview is very different from ours. Having a decentralized religion or a tradition, meta traditions, it is not their worldview. They don't even know about it. Lastly, I would like to say, recently I was talking to a student from STSU. She's an Afghani girl, and she has her own, very tragic story. But anyway, she was telling me, Hindus don't respect women. Now you imagine coming from an Afghani girl whose family was thrown out of Afghanistan. She came here at the age of 10. I say, why do you say that? I was kind of intrigued. One thing I can get defensive and agree, but I was acting as a professor that time in the role of a professor. I say, why do you say that? And her name is by chance, her name comes from Rig Veda, because her father gave her name as a Rig Veda, and she thinks that's why she has bad luck, because her name is a Hindu name. Anyway, so I say, why do you think that? She said, because Hindus have to give dowry. And that's why I feel, Professor, that Hindus don't respect their women. Otherwise, why do you have to give dowry to marry your daughters? And this question was also asked by a Christian student, American white student earlier. And now we have to see how we reply, right? I replied in terms of inheritance. The Hindu girls, once you are married, you have no rights in your parents' property. You inherit all the rights in your husband's property, which is very different, because in Islam, you girls have 25% rights in their parents' property. So I said, when girl grows up in a household and she suddenly loses all the rights and gets all the rights in husband's family, so parents say, okay, now you are leaving our family, we give you these gifts. And she said, oh, that makes perfect sense. So we have to, come up with these explanations which we never needed when we were in India. Someone raised that issue. In India, we were never confronted with these things. So rather than getting defensive, if we think about issues, whether it's a beef or this, then we can reach out to a lot of people while keeping in view where they are coming from. So I'll stop here. Thank you, Praveenji, for giving this opportunity again.
Is there anybody else who wants to say the final word, or?
Could I just make a couple of comments?
Yeah. Surya wants to. Go ahead, Surya.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha. I'll just go from my experience. I was born in Norway. I lived there in South Korea before coming to England for university. And I went to an international school. So throughout, I was kind of like aware of what Hindu culture is about, because it's something that, my father would do a puja every day. I'd be aware. My mother would be teaching. She studied Indian philosophy. She did her doctorate in that. So I used to kind of learn something at home, but I wasn't fully aware of what I was learning. In terms of, like, I couldn't put a label on it. They never said, this is Hindu and you label yourself as this when you go somewhere. They kind of let it organically grow. And I went through the phase of saying that, look, I'm atheist, I'm agnostic, without knowing exactly what those terms really meant entirely, right? Like I went through the whole questioning phase, and eventually I went back to the same Indic philosophies. And then I opened up the books that were there at home. And I started reconciling a lot of science with the philosophies. And then I started, and the internet really opened up a lot for me, you know, especially, I would say probably, I didn't explore that much while I was in university, but probably more after that. And then I kind of went full circle back in my late 20s to kind of where my parents really came from and what their thought process was. Not entirely, but largely. And I think that in many ways, it is also tied to understanding Indian history and politics, because, and you know, they may sound completely separate, but they're not, especially in the context of, you know, the sort of neo-imperialist academic construct that we all are kind of a part of in some way, because we're within this ecosystem, and it's very hard to break out of it. The internet kind of, and YouTube and the lectures that were there online and the books that I could read kind of got me outside that space. And for me, that was very important in reasserting who I am, but also understanding what is happening in India. What is decolonization? What's the debate really about? And when you start seeing the counter narrative on the political side, you can kind of reconcile that with maybe some internal questions that you may have around philosophy and religion. And then you can kind of match these two and say that, look, perhaps I need to reevaluate where I was coming from. And I think it's a very useful way to kind of get to a more, to build up towards something which is more constructive and kind of get back to your roots. That was kind of, I mean, I can't explain the whole journey of mine, but I think that theoretically I kind of explained it in some ways here. As Raj was saying, I think it's very important the parents play a very important role in this, and anchoring, and not like forcing that, but kind of just kind of giving that bit of a tug sometimes, or a nudge to say, okay, look at this, why don't you think about this or that? And then it shapes the way, and we're born very free as Hindus. That's the thing. Our mind is very open, and we're willing to be receptive. And I think that that ultimately is what gets us back to a very liberal sort of space where we appreciate that a very rigid construct of which kind of cages us is not for us. So we definitely know ultimately what we're not, and then we come back to what we really are.
Thank you, Surya. That was a good concluding comment. I will just remind everybody, Surya speaks exactly the same way at Clubhouse, and I'm very, very concerned that he has been suspended.
I got suspended again.
Yeah, so you need to understand that. And the reason is that he's very eloquent. And I think such people can make very potent points, and they target not the ones who may come and make noise, they target the ones that can have an impact. So this is a serious concern, and maybe that should be a topic of another meeting, but I would like to conclude now. So Manjari, any other thoughts you have before we go?
No, I think we're ready to conclude. Thank you everyone for coming. This event has been recorded and will be available on the Indian Americans of Irvine and Orange County IAIOC website. Thank you very much for coming.